On January 1st, 1857, a freezing winter wind cut through the barren oak trees of Phelps County, Missouri, marking the arrival of an infant born into a grueling existence of manual labor and relentless poverty. Henry Newton Brown entered a harsh environment dominated by rocky soil, dense brush, and an uncompromising climate. The Missouri Ozarks offered no comfort to struggling families, demanding continuous physical exertion just to secure basic survival. Log cabins provided minimal shelter against the biting frost, with drafts pulling the heat from stone hearths straight out into the timber. Dirt floors turned to deep mud during the spring thaws, spreading dampness into the bedding and clothing of the inhabitants. Survival depended entirely on farming the stubborn ground and hunting the local game inhabiting the forested hillsides. Disease swept through the rural settlements with devastating frequency, striking down adults and children without warning. Brown lost his parents to illness early in his childhood, removing his primary source of protection and stability. The sudden absence of a mother and father left the boy entirely dependent on the charity of extended relatives living nearby. An uncle took him into his own crowded, drafty farmhouse, expecting the young orphan to earn his keep through rigorous daily labor. There was no time for idle play or formal schooling. The rural economy required every available pair of hands to work the fields. Brown learned quickly that his value rested solely on his capacity to endure pain, exhaustion, and the strict discipline enforced by his surrogate guardians. Mornings began hours before sunrise, initiated by the jarring sound of a rooster crowing and the sharp command to fetch water from the distant creek. Brown carried sloshing wooden buckets back up the steep, frost-covered hills, his small fingers blistering and cracking in the biting air. Firewood needed chopping, requiring the boy to swing a forged iron axe into dense oak logs until his arms ached and his palms bled. The calluses formed thick layers over his hands, hardening his skin into a rough, leather-like texture. Breakfast consisted of meager portions of cornmeal mush and salted pork, eaten rapidly before heading out into the expanding fields for the primary chores of the day. Working the soil in Phelps County involved breaking apart compacted clay and removing large stones that damaged the iron plowshares. Brown walked behind the mules, gripping the rough wooden handles of the plow as it violently jolted over hidden rocks, sending sharp shocks up his forearms. During the high summer months, the temperature soared, bringing swarms of biting flies and mosquitoes that attacked any exposed skin. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and mixing with the choking dust kicked up by the pounding hooves of the livestock. He swung a dull iron hoe for hours on end, chopping down invasive weeds competing with the struggling cornstalks for the limited moisture in the ground. The isolation of the farm allowed resentment to build within the growing teenager. Brown witnessed other men traveling through the region on horseback, carrying firearms and speaking of expansive territories further west where money flowed freely. The rigid, repetitive confines of the Missouri farm offered nothing but a lifetime of backbreaking servitude and early death. Discipline from his uncle remained severe, often involving physical strikes for minor infractions or perceived laziness. Brown hardened his mind against the continuous scolding, learning to suppress his emotions and focus entirely on planning his departure. He secretly stockpiled meager provisions, wrapping dried meat and hard biscuits in a spare, coarse cotton shirt. In the spring of 1874, 17-year-old Henry Newton Brown abandoned the Phelps County farm. Walking westward without speaking a word of farewell to his relatives, he traveled, entirely on foot during the first several weeks, sticking to the dusty wagon ruts carved into the dirt by countless pioneers. Rainstorms drenched his clothing, forcing him to sleep shivering under the inadequate cover of fallen tree trunks or shallow caves. He drank water directly from muddy streams, occasionally trading his limited labor at isolated homesteads for a hot meal or a safe place to sleep inside a barn. His boots wore thin against the abrasive gravel, developing holes that allowed sharp stones to cut into the soles of his feet. Crossing the vast open plains into the Colorado Territory presented an entirely different environment, replacing the dense forests with endless miles of dry, knee-high grass. The relentless sun baked the earth, cracking the ground and completely drying up the shallow watering holes. Brown hitched rides on slow-moving freight wagons, sitting atop wooden crates filled with mining supplies and basic dry goods. The teamsters allowed him to ride in, exchange for his help unharnessing the draft horses and repairing broken leather traces. He observed the armed men guarding the freight, noting the worn wooden grips of their revolvers and the casual confidence they displayed in this lawless region. Upon arriving in the dusty, windswept settlements of Colorado, Brown sought employment among the sprawling cattle ranches dominating the local economy. He possessed no prior experience with horses or livestock on a large scale, but his capacity for enduring physical punishment made him an acceptable candidate for the lowest tier of ranch work. The seasoned cowboys assigned him the most dangerous and degrading tasks, testing his resolve and his temper. They forced him to ride unbroken, aggressive Mustangs that violently bucked and twisted, throwing the teenager hard into the wooden corral fences. He suffered bruised ribs, a broken nose, and countless scrapes, yet he continuously climbed back into the leather saddle until the animals eventually tired. Working the cattle herds introduced Brown to a chaotic existence filled with continuous noise and blinding dust. The longhorn cattle possessed sharp horns capable of easily piercing a horse's flank or a man's chest. Brown learned to aggressively swing a coiled hemp rope, aiming the loop to catch the hind legs of calves needing branding. The branding process involved wrestling the struggling, frightened animals to the dirt, pressing a glowing hot iron against their ribs. The stench of burning hair and searing flesh filled his nostrils, mixing with the overwhelming smell of manure and trampled sagebrush. Living conditions on the open range stripped away any remaining comforts of civilization. The men slept on the hard ground wrapped in coarse wool blankets, vulnerable to sudden drops in temperature and aggressive rattlesnakes seeking warmth. Meals consisted solely of dried beans, tough biscuits baked in cast-iron Dutch ovens, and bitter boiling coffee that stained their teeth. Bathing occurred rarely, usually involving a quick plunge into a freezing, fast-moving river before rushing back to the warmth of the roaring campfire. Brown embraced the dirt and the stench, finding a strange sense of belonging among these hardened men, who judged a person solely by their physical competence and willingness to work. The continuous threat of cattle thieves and hostile native raiding parties required every cowboy to remain armed at all times. Brown purchased his first firearm, a percussion-cap Colt revolver, using his accumulated wages from months of grueling trail work. He spent his limited free time meticulously disassembling the weapon, memorizing the function of the hammer, the cylinder, and the internal springs. The complex process of loading the weapon required pouring measured amounts of black powder into each chamber, seating a spherical metal projectile on top and ramming it down tightly with the hinged lever. He carefully placed tiny brass percussion caps onto the nipples at the rear of the cylinder, preparing the gun to fire. Target practice became a daily ritual, driven by an obsessive need to master the iron tool hanging from his leather belt. Brown aimed at discarded tin cans, tree stumps, and the bleached skulls of dead cattle littering the prairie. The recoil of the revolver snapped his wrist upward, sending a dense cloud of white sulfurous smoke billowing into his face. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed across the empty plains, followed by the satisfying thud of the metal slug, tearing into the wooden targets. He practiced drawing the weapon swiftly from the holster, working to eliminate any wasted movement and bring the sights to eye level in a fraction of a second. By 1875, the cattle drives began to slow as the markets fluctuated, forcing Brown to seek alternative ways to earn a living. Rumors circulated around the campfires regarding substantial profits waiting down in the Texas Panhandle, where vast herds of buffalo still roamed the plains. Men spoke of skinners earning small fortunes in mere months, trading stacks of cured hides to the eastern markets for weighed gold coins. Driven by the desire for wealth and independence, Brown packed his limited belongings, saddled his horse, and rode south toward the desolate, dangerous hunting grounds of Texas. The buffalo camps scattered across the Texas Panhandle presented an apocalyptic landscape of blood, bone, and rotting meat. Millions of flies swarmed the region, drawn by the overwhelming stench of decay rising from the thousands of flayed carcasses left baking under the brutal sun. Men lived in squalid canvas tents pitched directly in the dirt, their clothing permanently stained dark crimson from the daily slaughter. Brown rode into one of these camps, his nostrils burning from the putrid air, and offered his services to a crew of experienced hunters. They handed him a set of razor-sharp butcher knives, pointing him toward a freshly killed pile of shaggy beasts. Skinning a fully grown buffalo required immense upper body strength and an iron stomach. Brown gripped the matted hair of the dead animal, plunging the long steel blade into the hide near the throat. He sliced downward along the belly, the knife tearing through layers of fat and muscle, releasing a sudden rush of trapped heat and foul-smelling gases from the intestines. Blood coated his hands and forearms, drying into a sticky, uncomfortable crust that cracked every time he flexed his fingers. He pulled the hide backward with all his might, using the blade to sever the connective tissues binding the skin to the meat, grunting loudly with the physical exertion. The sheer volume of the slaughter strained the limits of human endurance. The hunters shot dozens of animals every single day, leaving the skinners struggling to process the bodies before the rapid decomposition ruined the valuable hides. Brown worked from dawn until dusk, kneeling in the muddy pools of congealed blood, surrounded by the exposed ribs and organs of the slaughtered herd. Vultures circled overhead, occasionally swooping down to tear at the abandoned meat before the men even finished their tasks. He sharpened his knives repeatedly on a coarse whetstone, the friction wearing the steel blades down to narrow, lethal points. After several months of grueling labor as a skinner, Brown transitioned into the role of a primary hunter, securing a long-barreled Sharps rifle. This imposing weapon weighed over 12 pounds, designed specifically to deliver devastating physical force at extreme distances. The gun utilized large brass cartridges packed tightly with coarse black powder and topped with .50 caliber projectiles. The recoil of the Sharps proved punishing, bruising the shooter's shoulder with every single discharge. Brown learned to fashion a stable resting point using crossed wooden sticks, ensuring his aim remained perfectly steady while scanning the distant horizon for the grazing herds. Stalking the buffalo required immense patience and a deep understanding of the wind currents shifting across the flat plains. The animals possessed poor eyesight but an incredibly acute sense of smell, instantly bolting if they detected the scent of unwashed humans or horse sweat. Brown crawled forward on his stomach through the sharp prairie grass, dragging the rifle beside him, ignoring the biting insects and the rough thorns tearing at his clothing. He closed the distance to within 200 yards, finding a concealed position behind a slight rise in the terrain. He carefully deployed his wooden resting sticks, settling the octagonal barrel firmly into the supportive cradle. The mechanics of the hunt required selecting a target on the outer edge of the herd, usually a large cow or a young bull. Brown pulled the external hammer back until it locked with a loud metallic click. He settled his cheek against the smooth wooden stock, aligning the rear ladder sight with the front blade. Holding his breath to completely steady his chest, he applied steady pressure to the front trigger, releasing the sear and sending the firing pins smashing into the brass primer. A blinding flash of fire erupted from the muzzle, accompanied by a deafening roar that physically shook the ground beneath his chest. The metal projectile struck the buffalo behind the front shoulder, shattering the ribs and tearing violently through the lungs. The animal lurched forward, blood pouring rapidly from its nose and mouth before collapsing into the dirt. The rest of the herd often remained perfectly still, confused by the sudden noise and the lack of a visible predator. Brown capitalized on this confusion, working the lever of the sharps to eject the spent brass casing, which flew backward, burning his forearm. He smoothly inserted a fresh cartridge into the smoking breech, locked the block upward, and cocked the hammer for the next shot. He established what the hunters called a stand, dropping animal after animal from a stationary, concealed position. The booming of the rifle echoed continuously for hours, creating a growing pile of dead livestock dotting the grassy landscape. The barrel of the sharps heated up to dangerous temperatures, forcing Brown to pour precious water down the steel tube to cool it, preventing the black powder from detonating prematurely in the chamber. He fired until his shoulder throbbed with a deep, sickening pain, and his ears rang continuously from the sheer volume of the repeated explosions. He left behind a trail of devastation, transforming the living prairie into a silent graveyard of exposed bones and rotting flesh. The financial rewards of the buffalo hunt brought Brown into contact with a dangerous transient society operating out of isolated trading posts scattered across the panhandle. Men arrived in these crude settlements driving wooden wagons piled high with stiff, dried hides. The merchants weighed the cargo, handing over thick stacks of paper currency and silver coins in exchange for the bloody harvest. The sudden influx of wealth fueled aggressive, destructive behavior among the hunters, who funneled their earnings directly into the makeshift saloons and gambling tents operating out of large canvas structures. Whiskey flowed continuously, poured from unlabeled glass jugs into dirty tin cups, searing the throats of the hardened laborers. Inside these crowded, smoke-filled tents, violence erupted with startling frequency. Disagreements over a game of cards or an accidental spilled drink frequently escalated into physical altercations. Men swung wooden chairs, shattered glass bottles against support poles, and drew their hunting knives without hesitation. Brown navigated this volatile environment with a cold, detached awareness, keeping his hand resting closely near the revolver strapped to his thigh. He learned to identify the subtle shifts in posture and tone signaling an impending attack, reacting swiftly to neutralize threats before they fully materialized. A particular incident solidified Brown's reputation as a man willing to use lethal force to protect his interests. An argument broke out over the payment of a hide contract, involving a larger, older hunter demanding a share of Brown's earnings. The older man lunged forward, his face contorted in anger, a skinning knife tightly gripped in his right hand. Brown stepped backward, his hand dropping swiftly to his holster, drawing the Colt with practiced, fluid motion. He cocked the hammer during the upward draw, leveling the barrel directly at the man's chest. The click of the locking mechanism echoed sharply through the sudden silence of the tent, freezing the attacker mid-step. The confrontation ended without a single shot fired, as the older hunter recognized the absolute lack of hesitation in the teenager's eyes. Brown held the gun perfectly steady, his finger resting lightly against the trigger, daring the man to move another inch forward. The attacker slowly lowered his blade, turning away and muttering curses as he shoved his way out through the canvas flaps of the saloon. This calculated display of calm aggression earned Brown a distinct level of respect among the rough population of the buffalo camps. He realized that a willingness to kill, combined with the visible capacity to do so quickly, served as the ultimate currency in this lawless region. By the end of 1876, the southern herds of buffalo faced near total eradication, leaving the vast plains empty and silent. The lucrative skinning operations shut down rapidly as the supply of animals vanished, forcing the hunters to pack their wagons and disperse in search of new opportunities. The piles of bones bleached perfectly white under the Texas sun, creating miles of macabre markers indicating the scale of the slaughter. The environment changed drastically, the grass growing taller, without the grazing of the beasts, burying the remnants of the camps. Brown stood at a critical crossroad, holding a pouch of silver coins and a deeply ingrained set of violent skills. He had transformed from a vulnerable, overworked Missouri farm boy into a hardened, armed survivor capable of extreme brutality. The manual labor of his youth no longer held any appeal. He preferred the sharp, dangerous edge of frontier existence. He packed his saddlebags with extra ammunition, carefully cleaned his Sharps rifle and his Colt revolver, and mounted his horse. Turning his back on the empty plains of Texas, Henry Newton Brown spurred his animal westward, riding steadily toward the unpredictable territory of New Mexico. During the autumn months of 1877, Henry Newton Brown guided his horse across the treacherous alkaline shallows of the Pecos River, penetrating the volatile expanse of the New Mexico territory. The topography shifted profoundly from the flat, grassy plains of Texas into a jagged, unforgiving environment defined by steep mesas, deep arroyos, and sprawling patches of sharp yucca plants. A dry, unrelenting wind scoured the valley floor, picking up fine white dirt that coated his clothing and caked onto his sweat-dampened skin. Hydration sources proved incredibly scarce, often tainted with bitter minerals that cramped the stomach and sickened the livestock. Surviving this brutal crossing required careful rationing of his canteens and constant horizon scanning for hostile raiding parties. The westward journey directed him toward the Capitan Mountains, where the arid scrub eventually yielded to dense forests of towering ponderosa pines. Elevation steadily increased, dropping the ambient temperatures and replacing the thick valley dust with crisp, thin mountain air. Brown followed the winding dirt trails downward into a long, narrow depression cradling the remote settlement of Lincoln. The community consisted of a single, unpaved thoroughfare bordered by thick-walled adobe structures featuring flat roofs and deep, shaded porches. Small irrigation trenches ran parallel to the road, funneling muddy current from the nearby Rio Bonito to sustain scattered patches of corn and beans. A massive two-story commercial building dominated the western end of the street, serving as the headquarters for an entrenched economic monopoly known locally as the House. Operated by James Dolan and John Riley, this mercantile controlled virtually every facet of commerce within the sprawling county. They secured highly lucrative government contracts to supply beef to the nearby military installations and native reservations, effectively shutting out any independent competition. Their political influence extended deep into the territorial government, ensuring their business practices remained completely unchallenged by the local legal system. The House utilized a predatory credit system, forcing small-scale ranchers and farmers into crushing debt they could never realistically repay. When a family inevitably defaulted on their inflated grocery bills, Dolan swiftly seized their land and livestock through heavily biased court rulings. The enterprise functioned as an inescapable trap for the impoverished settlers attempting to carve out a living in the harsh valley. Control over the region's finances allowed the merchants to dictate the price of every essential commodity, from flour and coffee to ammunition and building supplies. Sheriff William Brady, a staunch ally of the monopoly, eagerly enforced these property seizures with a badge and a heavily armed posse. The lawmen operating out of Lincoln functioned less as peace officers and more as a private security force protecting the financial interests of the prominent merchants. Brady routinely deputized known criminals and ruthless gunmen, providing them with legal authority to harass, intimidate, and occasionally eliminate anyone defying the House. The county jail served merely as a holding pen for Dolan's enemies, while actual outlaws allied with the merchants operated with total impunity. Brown observed these tense dynamics while renting a small, drafty stall in the local livery stable, spending his remaining silver coins on basic provisions. He noted the constant presence of hardened enforcers loitering outside the saloons, men explicitly hired by Dolan to intimidate dissenting citizens. These hired guards carried their revolvers low on their hips, openly displaying their readiness to commit violence on behalf of their wealthy employers. A heavy, palpable anxiety hung over the dusty street, dictating the hushed conversations and cautious movements of the ordinary townspeople. A distinct shift in the balance of power occurred shortly prior to Brown's arrival, initiated by a wealthy, ambitious English investor named John Tunstall. Partnering with a skilled lawyer named Alexander McSween, the Englishman opened a competing retail store and banking operation directly across the street from the house. Tunstall possessed deep financial resources, allowing him to offer significantly fairer prices for goods and much higher wages for laborers. This direct challenge threatened to completely dismantle the profitable stranglehold Dolan had meticulously built over the past several years. To supply his new mercantile and secure his own government beef contracts, Tunstall purchased a sprawling cattle ranch located 30 miles south of town along the Rio Feliz. Operating this distant property required hiring a dedicated crew of skilled riders capable of protecting the growing herd from Dolan's affiliated rustlers. The escalating hostility between the rival factions meant that a ranch hand needed profound proficiency with firearms alongside basic equestrian skills. Word spread through the valley that the Englishman paid premium wages for men willing to fight to defend his investments. Seeking steady employment and recognizing an environment suited to his particular talents, Brown rode south to the Rio Feliz property. He approached the crude, fortified dugout serving as the main bunkhouse, keeping his hands carefully away from his weapons to avoid provoking the guards. Tunstall interviewed the young drifter, taking careful note of his unblinking demeanor and the heavily worn grips of his Colt revolver. Recognizing the cold, pragmatic violence lurking beneath the surface, the Englishman offered him a position on the security detail without hesitation. Life at the Tunstall Ranch introduced Brown to a tight-knit, highly capable group of young men sharing similar backgrounds of frontier hardship. The foreman, a seasoned cattleman named Richard Brewer, managed the daily operations with strict authority and a keen tactical mind. Among the crew was a slender, soft-spoken teenager named William Bonney, possessing lightning-fast reflexes and an easy, disarming smile. The men bonded over shared duties, spending their evenings cleaning their weapons, repairing saddle leather, and discussing the inevitable confrontation brewing in town. The primary armament for the ranch security consisted of lever-action Winchester rifles, offering a devastating combination of high capacity and rapid fire. Brown adapted quickly to the center-fire mechanics, practicing the swift downward thrust of the lever to chamber a fresh brass cartridge into the breech. He mastered the process of sliding individual rounds through the side-loading gate, filling the long tubular magazine running securely beneath the steel barrel. These modern weapons provided a distinct tactical advantage over the older single-shot rifles still carried by many of the local outlaws. Winter fully gripped the New Mexico highlands by late 1877, blanketing the Rio Feliz Valley in thick, pristine snow. The dropping temperatures forced the cowboys to wear heavy canvas coats and thick wool gloves while conducting their daily perimeter patrols. They rode along the frozen riverbanks, scanning the treacherous tree lines for any signs of raiding parties sent by the Seven Rivers faction, a ruthless gang firmly allied with the house. Maintaining the security of the herd required absolute vigilance, as the frozen terrain completely masked the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Back in Lincoln, the political dispute rapidly deteriorated into a vicious legal war. McSween became entangled in a complex insurance payout dispute, providing Dolan with the perfect excuse to leverage his corrupted judicial connections. Judge Warren Bristol issued a sweeping writ of attachment against McSween's properties, intending to bleed the lawyer's finances dry. Dolan aggressively manipulated the boundaries of the legal document, illegally expanding the writ to authorize the seizure of Tunstall's completely separate business assets. Sheriff Brady eagerly assembled a massive posse to enforce this fraudulent court order, filling his ranks with notorious criminals and known cattle thieves. This heavily armed contingent received explicit instructions to travel south, secure the Rio Feliz ranch, and confiscate every single head of livestock belonging to the Englishmen. The deployment of a corrupted law enforcement body to conduct a blatant robbery shattered any remaining illusion of peace within the volatile county. The sheer size of the posse guaranteed a violent clash if they encountered any resistance from the ranch hands. During mid-February 1878, an exhausted messenger reached the Tunstall Ranch, delivering urgent news of the approaching posse. Realizing his men were vastly outnumbered, Tunstall made the calculated decision to abandon the main cattle herd and seek a judicial resolution in Lincoln. He believed his status as a British citizen and his considerable wealth would shield him from outright assassination while navigating the court system. He ordered his crew to saddle their best horses and prepare for a rapid, freezing ride through the mountains. On the morning of February 18, 1878, the small group departed the ranch, pushing through the deep snowdrifts accumulating along the trails. Tunstall rode near the rear, accompanied by Brown, Bonnie Brewer, John Middleton, and Robert Weidenman, driving 9 prized, unbranded horses ahead of them. The cold wind bit fiercely at their exposed faces, freezing the moisture from their breath onto their woolen collars and scarves. They maintained a brisk pace, hoping to reach the safety of the town before the sheriff's men could intercept them. Their chosen route wound through a narrow, treacherous canyon flanked by steep, timber-covered ridges restricting their visibility. The rugged terrain forced the horses to slow down, their hooves slipping dangerously on patches of hidden ice covering the rocky path. Thick clusters of scrub oak and juniper bushes lined the trail, creating hundreds of perfect natural concealment points for an ambush. The profound silence of the winter forest amplified the nervous snorting of the animals and the creaking of cold saddle leather. Late in the afternoon, the sound of galloping hooves echoed ominously off the canyon walls from behind them. A massive contingent of Sheriff Brady's posse, numbering roughly 30 heavily armed men, had discovered their trail and pushed their mounts to a grueling sprint. The pursuers closed the distance rapidly, their weapons drawn and ready, shouting aggressive commands that carried sharply through the frigid mountain air. The sheer numbers of the pursuing force indicated a clear intent to inflict violence rather than serve legal documents. A sudden distraction fractured the defensive formation of Tunstall's group just as the danger became apparent. A flock of wild turkeys broke cover from the brush, scattering loudly up a steep hillside flanking the narrow trail. Brewer, Brown, Bonnie, and Weidenman spurred their horses upward into the trees to chase the birds, momentarily breaking visual contact with their employer. Tunstall remained down on the valley floor, completely isolated while attempting to control the frightened, panicking herd of unbranded horses. The posse swarmed over a low ridge, plunging directly into the valley and unleashing a massive volley of gunfire. Heavy-caliber projectiles tore violently through the pine branches, splintering the tree trunks and sending showers of bark and snow raining down. The deafening roar of 30 rifles and revolvers discharging simultaneously shattered the quiet afternoon, filling the canyon with thick white clouds of sulphurous smoke. The chaotic barrage effectively trapped Tunstall in the open, cutting off any avenue of escape. Brown and his companions scrambled for cover behind massive granite boulders dotting the high ground, dismounting swiftly and raising their Winchesters. They assessed the chaotic scene below, realizing instantly they were hopelessly outgunned and thoroughly outmaneuvered by the aggressive assault. Returning fire from their elevated position risked striking their employer, and descending into the valley guaranteed their own slaughter. They remained pinned down, forced to watch the brutal confrontation unfolding helplessly on the snowy ground below. Tunstall finally recognized the deadly reality of his situation, realizing his wealth and nationality offered zero protection against these hardened killers. He brought his horse to a halt and dismounted slowly, raising his hands in a clear, universal gesture of surrender. 3 prominent members of the posse, William Morton, Jesse Evans, and Tom Hill, spurred their mounts forward, completely surrounding the unarmed Englishman. They leveled their weapons at his chest, ignoring his desperate attempts to initiate a peaceful dialogue. A single gunshot cracked sharply from the circle of riders, striking Tunstall squarely in the torso. The impact knocked him backward, his body slamming heavily into the frozen, blood-stained dirt. While he lay gasping in the snow, another posse member dismounted, stepping calmly toward the wounded man. He aimed his heavy revolver directly at Tunstall's head, pulling the trigger at point-blank range, utterly destroying the man's skull and ending his life permanently. To complete the gruesome spectacle, the killers turned their weapons on Tunstall's prized horse, dropping the animal with a volley of bullets. They dragged the dead Englishman's body toward the carcass, resting his shattered head against the animal's neck in a macabre, mocking display. Having completed their brutal objective, the posse holstered their smoking weapons, turned their horses around and rode away, leaving the corpse to freeze. The canyon fell silent again, save for the wind whistling through the damaged pine branches. Nightfall descended rapidly over the canyon, plunging the temperature well below freezing and blanketing the grisly scene in deep shadows. Brown and the surviving hands carefully climbed down the treacherous hillside, their boots crunching loudly in the crusted snow. They found the mutilated remains of their employer, the brutal reality of the unprovoked murder searing itself permanently into their minds. Standing over the frozen blood, a profound, chilling resolve replaced their initial shock, cementing a unified desire for absolute, uncompromising retribution. They strapped the frozen body securely across a saddle, leading the burdened horse on the dark, somber trek into Lincoln. Arriving under the cover of darkness, they delivered the corpse to the mercantile and promptly reported the assassination to Justice of the Peace John Wilson. The brutal killing of a prominent citizen sent shockwaves of panic and outrage sweeping through the small community. The absolute corruption of Sheriff Brady's office was now undeniable, completely shattering any illusion of civic order within the county. The following day, the townspeople gathered inside the Tunstall mercantile to view the body, laid out on a rough wooden table. The horrific damage inflicted upon the Englishman's head fueled a deep, burning anger among the young cowboys he had employed. They refused to allow the blatantly corrupt legal system to sweep the assassination under the rug or protect the guilty parties. A solemn vow passed between the men. They would hunt down every single individual responsible for pulling a trigger in that canyon. Justice Wilson, operating outside the corrupted influence of the House, bravely issued legal arrest warrants for the identified killers. He appointed Dick Brewer as a special constable, granting him the lawful authority to form his own heavily armed posse. Brewer swiftly deputized Brown, Bonney, and several other loyal ranch hands, providing them with badges to legitimize their upcoming campaign of violence. They adopted a distinct title, calling themselves the Regulators, firmly committing to a path of relentless bloody vengeance. By early March 1878, the Regulators rode out of Lincoln, fully armed and relentlessly tracking the posse members across the harsh terrain. They pushed their horses to the absolute limit, enduring freezing nights, sleeping directly on the frosty ground without fires to avoid detection. Meals consisted of cold, hard biscuits and dried beef, eaten in the saddle while constantly scanning the horizon for their targets. The hunt consumed them entirely, driving them deep into the desolate regions of the territory in search of the fugitive killers. On March 6, 1878, their relentless pursuit finally yielded results near the banks of the Pecos River. Following a brief, frantic gunfight, they successfully captured William Morton and Frank Baker, two prominent figures involved in the canyon ambush. The regulators disarmed the exhausted men, tightly binding their wrists with rough hemp rope and forcing them back onto their saddles. Securing the prisoners marked a significant victory, but the logistical challenge of transporting them safely back to Lincoln presented a severe risk. The return journey stretched over 3 agonizing days, culminating on March 9, 1878, when the regulators halted near a secluded rocky gorge known as Agua Negra. The group pulled the bound prisoners from their mounts, drawing their weapons and delivering a ruthless volley of point-blank fire, leaving Morton and Baker dead in the dirt and firmly pushing Henry Newton Brown past the point of no return. Following the brutal executions in the remote brush of Agua Negra, Henry Newton Brown and his fellow gunmen rode back toward the settlement of Lincoln under a shifting political climate. The harsh winter frost began yielding to the early spring thaws of late March 1878, turning the previously frozen mountain trails into deep, treacherous channels of viscous mud. The horses struggled fiercely against the clinging mire, their hooves sinking deep into the saturated earth with every single step forward. The riders arrived back in the valley exhausted, covered in dried sweat and freezing sludge, fully aware their status within the territory had permanently fractured. Their previous legal cover as a sanctioned posse evaporated entirely as word of the unauthorized killings reached the higher echelons of the territorial government in Santa Fe. Governor Samuel Axtell, firmly aligned with the wealthy merchants controlling the county, issued a sweeping executive proclamation, explicitly revoking the commissions of the local justice of the peace and the special constables. The official document declared the regulators an illegal band of armed outlaws, stripping away any remaining facade of lawful authority they possessed. This legal maneuver effectively handed complete, uncontested control of the region back to the very faction responsible for instigating the initial violence. Brown absorbed this shift in power with cold pragmatism, understanding the piece of tin pinned to his coat no longer offered any protection from the hangman's noose. The men retreated into the fortified confines of the late Englishman's mercantile, transforming the sturdy commercial building into an armed, defensive compound. The sprawling structure sat securely on the eastern edge of the town, featuring a large enclosed yard attached to the rear section of the property. Dense adobe walls, constructed from sun-baked dirt and coarse yellow straw, surrounded the livestock pen, providing a formidable barrier against incoming rifle fire. The western perimeter of this enclosure extended parallel to the main unpaved road traversing through the center of the settlement, offering a concealed vantage point overlooking the dusty thoroughfare. Sturdy wooden gates secured the rear entrance, reinforced with forged iron hinges and locked by a heavy iron padlock. Brown spent his days patrolling the border of this enclosure, studying the sight lines and evaluating the structural integrity of the dried mud fortifications. Inside the dark, quiet storerooms of the mercantile, the outlaws held tense, hushed discussions regarding their survival strategy. Remaining in a purely defensive posture guaranteed their eventual capture or slaughter once the rival faction gathered enough manpower to execute a full-scale siege. Taking the offensive required targeting the central figure anchoring the opposition's power, the man utilizing a silver badge to legitimize continuous harassment and murder. Sheriff William Brady represented the core of the corruption, shielding the merchants while actively hunting the surviving ranch hands. Eliminating the primary law enforcement officer would decapitate the rival organization, and plunge their coordinated efforts into absolute chaos. The tactical reality of assassinating a prominent county official required meticulous planning and total advantage of position. Engaging the sheriff in a fair, open confrontation on the street presented an unacceptable level of risk, as he constantly traveled with a heavily armed escort of deputies. Brown, William Bonney, Jim French, John Middleton, and Fred Waite formulated a calculated strategy relying entirely on surprise, concealment, and overwhelming concentrated firepower. They selected the western adobe wall of their own yard as the staging ground, utilizing its proximity to the main road and its dense, bullet-resistant composition. The thick barrier would hide their presence until the split second they initiated the ambush. Preparation began during the final days of March, involving strenuous physical labor hidden from the view of the townspeople walking past the property. The gunmen utilized sharp hunting knives, heavy iron chisels, and forged steel crowbars to carve narrow firing ports directly through the dense adobe material. Brown drove the tip of his chisel into the hardened mud, twisting the tool forcefully to break apart the baked clay and sever the binding strands of dried grass. The work proceeded slowly and quietly, generating piles of dry, dusty debris on the ground beneath the newly formed loopholes. They angled the cuts specifically to provide a wide field of view up and down the road while keeping the exterior openings as small as possible. Creating the firing ports required careful measurement to ensure the rifles could extend through the barricade without exposing the barrels to anyone looking in their direction. They carved the interior side of the holes significantly wider than the exterior, creating a funnel shape allowing the shooter to pivot the weapon tracking a moving target. The men tested the sight lines repeatedly, pressing their faces against the cool, rough mud and scanning the neighboring buildings across the street. The eastern sun would illuminate the road perfectly during the morning hours, casting bright light onto the targets while leaving the interior of the yard cloaked in obscuring shadows. On the evening of March 31st, 1878, the group finalized their armament, meticulously servicing their lever-action rifles by the dim light of a single kerosene lantern. Brown disassembled the action of his Winchester, wiping down the internal steel components with an oiled cloth to remove any accumulated grit or burnt powder residue. He inspected the brass cartridges individually, ensuring the primers sat flush and the slugs showed no signs of deformity. He fed the ammunition smoothly through the side-loading gate, the internal spring compressing with a stiff metallic click as each round entered the tubular magazine. The men worked in focused silence, the rhythmic sounds of racking levers and clicking hammers filling the enclosed space. The night air dropped to freezing temperatures, forcing the men to wrap themselves tightly in coarse wool blankets while taking up their positions behind the wall. They slept in rotating shifts directly on the cold, manure-stained dirt, keeping their loaded weapons resting mere inches from their hands. The dampness of the earth seeped through their clothing, chilling their joints and making sleep difficult and restless. Brown remained awake during the darkest hours, listening to the wind whistling through the narrow firing ports and the distant, lonely howling of coyotes up in the timber. He visualized the required sequence of movements, mentally rehearsing the swift mounting of the rifle and the smooth, steady pull of the trigger. Dawn broke on the morning of April 1st, 1878, casting long, pale rays of light over the jagged ridges of the Capitan Mountains. The settlement slowly stirred to life, the chimneys of the scattered adobe houses pushing thin columns of gray wood smoke up into the clear, freezing sky. The street remained empty during the earliest hours, the surface frozen solid by the overnight drop in temperature. Inside the pen, the 5 gunmen stood behind the barrier, their breath forming small white clouds in the frigid air as they peered through the narrow carved slots. They waited with unyielding patience, their eyes locked on the western approach leading from the county courthouse. The smell of raw horse manure and damp, turning earth filled the enclosure, mixing with the sharp metallic scent of gun oil and brass casings. Brown leaned his weight against the rough mud structure, feeling the grit pressing into the fabric of his coat. He checked the hammer of his rifle, ensuring it rested safely in the half-cocked notch, ready to be fully drawn back at the slightest provocation. The sunlight slowly crept down the sides of the neighboring buildings, eventually illuminating the center of the road and thawing the top layer of frozen dirt. Small flocks of birds chirped loudly from the nearby cottonwood trees, providing a deceptive, peaceful soundtrack to the impending violence. Shortly before 9 in the morning, the heavy wooden door of the distant mercantile swung open, revealing the highly anticipated target stepping out onto the covered porch. Sheriff William Brady emerged first, easily identifiable by his large, imposing frame and the polished silver badge pinned prominently to his vest. 4 deputies accompanied him, fanning out defensively as they descended the wooden steps and stepped onto the dirt thoroughfare. George Hindman, Billy Matthews, George Pepin, and John Long walked alongside the county official, their hands resting cautiously near the grips of their holstered revolvers. The lawmen moved eastward down the street, their leather boots crunching loudly against the partially frozen ground. Inside the yard, a tense, silent communication passed between the hidden shooters. Bonnie nodded sharply, signaling the approach, and the men raised their rifles in unison, carefully sliding the steel barrels into the prepared loopholes. Brown pressed his cheek against the smooth wooden stock of his Winchester, closing his left eye and aligning the rear ladder sight with the front blade. He tracked the group of 5 men as they walked directly into the designated kill zone, focusing his aim squarely on the broad chest of the sheriff. The unsuspecting lawmen continued their steady pace, closing the distance until they stood roughly 40 yards from the concealed muzzle of Brown's weapon. The command to fire came without a spoken word, initiated solely by the deafening crack of Bonnie's rifle tearing through the quiet morning. Brown swiftly pulled his own trigger, the recoil punching solidly into his shoulder as a bright flash of fire erupted from the barrel. 3 more rifles discharged within a fraction of a second, merging into an overwhelming roar of concentrated gunfire echoing forcefully off the surrounding buildings. A dense cloud of white, sulfurous smoke swiftly filled the narrow space behind the adobe barrier, stinging the men's eyes and burning their throats. They worked the levers of their weapons with practiced aggression, ejecting the spent brass casings and chambering fresh rounds. Out on the street, the devastating volley of heavy projectiles struck the lawmen with terrible, destructive force. Multiple slugs tore completely through Sheriff Brady's torso, shattering his ribs and destroying his vital organs before exiting through his back. The substantial physical trauma lifted the large man off his feet, throwing him backward onto the hard, rutted dirt of the road. He collapsed entirely, his blood pooling quickly in the dust, ending his life before he could even register the source of the attack. Deputy George Hindman also absorbed a brutal hit, a bullet striking him squarely in the neck, severing major arteries and dropping him to his knees. The remaining 3 deputies reacted with frantic desperation, scrambling wildly for cover as the second and third volleys of rifle fire tore through the air around them. Matthews, Pepin, and Long dove behind the protective corners of a nearby adobe house, drawing their revolvers and blindly returning fire toward the corral wall. Their hastily aimed bullets struck the mud barrier harmlessly, chipping away small pieces of dried clay and straw without penetrating the structure. Brown continued firing steadily through the narrow port, his barrel hot to the touch, suppressing the surviving lawmen and preventing them from mounting any organized counterattack. Out on the exposed road, Hindman struggled fiercely, clutching his bleeding throat and gasping for air as he crawled weakly toward the safety of a nearby building. He collapsed onto his stomach, his movements slowing drastically as his life drained out into the thawing mud. The street fell into a sudden, eerie lull, the deafening roar of the rifles replaced by the ringing in the shooter's ears and the moans of the dying deputy. The dense cloud of white smoke slowly drifted over the yard wall, carrying the acrid stench of burnt black powder across the settlement. The townspeople remained entirely hidden inside their homes, terrified by the sudden eruption of heavy combat in the center of their community. During this brief pause in the shooting, Bonnie and Jim French made a highly risky, uncalculated decision to break cover and secure a prize. The two young men unlatched the heavy wooden gate, sprinting out of the enclosure and directly into the open street toward the fallen sheriff. They intended to retrieve Brady's customized Winchester rifle, a valuable weapon lying in the dirt mere feet from the bleeding corpse. Brown remained behind the wall, his own rifle raised and scanning the neighboring buildings, providing covering fire for his exposed companions. The rash action exposed Bonnie and French to the remaining deputies currently barricaded down the road. Billy Matthews, a skilled and seasoned gunman, seized the opportunity presented by the two outlaws sprinting across the open ground. He rested his rifle against the corner of the adobe house, took careful aim, and squeezed the trigger. The slug struck Bonnie directly in the left thigh, tearing through the muscle tissue and shattering the bone. The sheer impact spun the teenager around, dropping him hard onto the ground just steps away from the sheriff's body. French also took a grazing hit to his leg, stumbling forward but maintaining his balance as the gunfire erupted once again. Recognizing the severity of the situation, French grabbed his wounded companion by the collar, dragging him desperately back toward the safety of the corral gate. Brown unleashed a rapid string of covering fire, forcing Matthews back behind the corner of the house and preventing him from delivering a fatal finishing shot. The bullets shattered the wooden trim around the deputy's hiding spot, sending sharp splinters flying through the air. French hauled Bonnie through the open gateway, collapsing onto the manure-stained dirt just as another volley of return fire slammed into the thick adobe wall outside. They quickly secured the heavy iron padlock, sealing themselves back inside the fortified enclosure. The atmosphere inside the pen shifted from calculated aggression to frantic medical triage. Bonnie lay on his back, his face entirely pale and his teeth clenched tightly together to suppress the agonizing pain radiating from his shattered thigh. Dark crimson blood soaked rapidly through his trousers, pooling onto the dry dirt beneath him. Brown tore a long strip of coarse cotton fabric from an extra shirt, wrapping it tightly around the upper portion of the young man's leg to create a crude tourniquet. He twisted the fabric fiercely, applying immense pressure to the severed arteries and drastically slowing the dangerous loss of blood. With the primary objective achieved and their most prominent member severely wounded, the regulators needed to fully abandon the defensive position before the surviving deputies rallied a larger force. They hoisted Bonnie onto the back of a sturdy horse, securing him tightly to the saddle horn with ropes to prevent him from falling off during the escape. The men mounted their own animals, keeping their rifles drawn and ready across their laps. They spurred the horses aggressively toward the rear exit of the property, bursting through the wooden gates and galloping swiftly toward the steep, timber-covered hills bordering the eastern edge of the settlement. The sharp sound of their retreating hooves faded quickly into the dense pine forests, leaving the town of Lincoln in a state of absolute, paralyzed shock. The blood-soaked bodies of the county sheriff and his deputy lay abandoned in the center of the main road, a gruesome testament to the total collapse of lawful authority. The calculated daytime assassination fundamentally altered the trajectory of the ongoing conflict, escalating the violence from isolated skirmishes in the wilderness to outright urban warfare. The wealthy merchants, previously shielded by the badge of their enforcer, now realized they possessed no protection against the ruthless, coordinated tactics of the surviving ranch hands. Brown rode near the rear of the escaping group, constantly checking his back trail for any signs of an organized pursuit. The cold spring wind whipped against his face, cooling the sweat pouring down his forehead. He checked the action of his Winchester, confirming the chamber held a live round, his thumb resting lightly against the hammer. The successful execution of the ambush solidified his position within the deeply fractured territory, as a highly capable, lethal combatant willing to cross any moral or legal boundary. The men pushed their horses hard into the rugged canyons, seeking the deep concealment of the wilderness to tend to their wounded and prepare for the inevitable. Widespread retaliation. The news of the daylight killing spread swiftly outward from the valley, carrying via telegraph wires and exhausted messengers to the neighboring military outposts and territorial offices. The audacious nature of the crime, striking down a prominent official in the center of his own jurisdiction, guaranteed an overwhelming response from the state apparatus. Arrest warrants specifically naming Brown, Bonney, and the others circulated widely, offering substantial financial rewards for their capture or their corpses. The men were no longer merely unemployed cowboys or frustrated posse members. They stood classified as the most dangerous wanted fugitives, operating within the entire southwestern frontier. Deep in the isolated mountains, the group established a crude, hidden camp beneath the heavy branches of the towering ponderosa pines. They built no fires, relying entirely on heavy blankets and shared body heat to survive the freezing nighttime temperatures. Brown focused on cleaning his weapons, stripping the foul black powder residue from the bore of his rifle with a brass brush and hot water. The smell of copper and blood permeated the small encampment, a constant reminder of the extreme violence they had unleashed just hours prior. They sustained themselves on dried provisions, rationing their limited water supplies while monitoring Bonnie's severe injury. For the deadly onset of infection, the assassination of Sheriff Brady successfully dismantled the primary enforcement tool of the rival faction, but it also painted a massive, inescapable target directly onto the backs of the regulators. The wealthy merchants utilized their vast financial resources to hire dozens of independent gunmen, forming a heavily armed private army dedicated entirely to hunting down the outlaws. The United States Army troops stationed at nearby Fort Stanton began conducting aggressive patrols through the region, explicitly ordered to assist in the capture of the wanted men. The sheer volume of armed forces mobilizing against them guaranteed that their temporary refuge in the mountains would eventually be discovered and violently compromised. On July 15, 1878, a relentless summer sun baked the dry valley of Lincoln, amplifying the deadly tension gripping the isolated settlement. Henry Newton Brown crouched inside the sprawling U-shaped residence of Alexander McSween, gripping his lever-action rifle with sweat-slicked hands. A vast contingent of armed men loyal to the Murphy-Dolan faction had successfully surrounded the property during the pre-dawn hours, cutting off any route of retreat into the neighboring Capitan Mountains. George Pepin, the newly appointed county sheriff acting on behalf of the wealthy merchants, commanded this massive posse. He deployed sharpshooters onto the rocky hillsides overlooking the town, effectively sealing the regulators inside a lethal trap. The McSween home occupied a highly strategic position near the center of the main thoroughfare, constructed with thick mud walls capable of stopping high-velocity projectiles. The building featured multiple interconnected rooms, wrapping securely around a central open-air courtyard, offering various firing angles against attackers approaching from the dirt road or the rear riverbank. Massive timber vigas supported the flat, earth-covered roof, providing structural integrity against the elements but creating a vulnerable target for plunging fire from the elevated ridges. The dense adobe absorbed the extreme midday heat, radiating warmth inward and turning the enclosed spaces into stifling, unventilated boxes. Inside the residence, 14 hardened men prepared for the impending assault by dragging bulky wooden furniture across the rough plank floors. Brown and his companions flipped solid oak dining tables onto their sides, wedging them firmly against the exterior doors to prevent a forced entry. They stacked stuffed feather mattresses, large sacks of flour, and thick wool blankets against the glass windows, leaving only narrow vertical slits open for their rifle barrels. The men worked in focused silence, their boots scraping against the floorboards as they transformed the comfortable domestic space into a heavily fortified bunker. The defenders included William Bonney, Jim French, Jose Chavez y Chavez, and their employer, Alexander McSween. The lawyer possessed zero combat experience, pacing nervously down the dark hallways while the seasoned gunmen meticulously serviced their weapons. Brown systematically checked his ammunition supply, laying out rows of large brass cartridges onto a wooden side table for rapid reloading. He wiped the accumulated grime from the breech of his Winchester, ensuring the internal mechanisms functioned smoothly without catching on stray grit. The sheer volume of incoming firepower required every defender to maintain absolute readiness and perfect mechanical reliability. The opening shots of the protracted siege cracked through the dry air just prior to noon, striking the exterior of the house with loud, dull thuds. Splinters of dried pine and jagged fragments of baked clay rained down inside the front parlor as incoming fire shattered the exposed window frames. Brown pressed his shoulder against a sturdy door jamb, angling his rifle barrel through a small gap in the barricade. He sighted a sudden movement near the distant mercantile across the street and squeezed the trigger, sending a copper-jacketed slug flying forcefully across the empty dirt road. A thunderous exchange of gunfire erupted across the entire settlement, echoing fiercely off the steep, rocky canyon walls. The Pepin posse utilized long-range rifles to constantly pepper the McSween roof, attempting to drive the defenders away from the upper vantage points. The regulators returned fire methodically, carefully conserving their limited ammunition by only shooting at fully visible targets. The interior of the house swiftly filled with the acrid stench of burnt black powder, burning the men's eyes and coating their throats with a harsh metallic taste. Every discharge added to the thick gray haze accumulating beneath the ceiling beams. As the afternoon dragged on, the extreme heat inside the barricaded rooms became a severe physical torment. The July sun beat down mercilessly on the flat roof, transforming the residence into a baking oven with zero cross-ventilation. The men stripped off their thick canvas coats and vests, their cotton shirts thoroughly saturated with foul-smelling perspiration. The walls trapped the rising temperatures, forcing the gunmen to rotate away from the windows just to cool down. Thirst quickly became a pressing concern, exacerbating the exhaustion settling into their cramped muscles. Brown maintained his position near the front parlor, his ears ringing from the constant concussive blasts of his own weapon discharging in the enclosed space. He watched the dusty road outside, noting the absolute absence of civilian movement. The ordinary residents of Lincoln cowered beneath their wooden floorboards or fled deep into the surrounding brush, abandoning the town entirely to the warring factions. The relentless crackle of rifle fire continued without pause, a steady, punishing soundtrack to the localized war raging in the center of the county. No stray dogs or livestock wandered the thoroughfare. Everything living had sought deep cover. Nightfall brought a slight drop in temperature, but no cessation of hostilities. Muzzle flashes illuminated the dark hillside like scattered lightning, marking the elevated positions of the besieging gunmen. Brown sat against the cool adobe wall, chewing on a tough strip of dried beef in the pitch black. The men slept in short, restless shifts, clutching their rifles tightly against their chests, expecting a sudden, violent breach of the doors at any moment. The darkness amplified the sound of the incoming projectiles smacking into the exterior mud, preventing any true, restorative rest. Dawn on July 16th revealed the grim reality of their prolonged entrapment. The Pepin forces had utilized the cover of darkness to dig shallow trenches much closer to the property, tightening the perimeter and drastically restricting the regulators' field of view. Bullets struck the walls with increasing frequency, chipping away at the protective mud layer and exposing the wooden framework underneath. The constant threat of sudden death forced the defenders to crawl flat on their stomachs when moving between the various rooms. Any shadow passing behind a window slit instantly drew a concentrated volley from the hidden trenches. The lack of accessible drinking water began to severely impact the combat effectiveness of the trapped men. Their mouths grew entirely dry, their lips cracking and bleeding in the arid, dust-filled environment. The single well located in the rear courtyard remained dangerously exposed to the sharpshooters perched on the eastern ridges. The men stared longingly through the rear windows at the wooden bucket hanging above the cool water, knowing a trip outside meant certain death. They scavenged the kitchen for any remaining liquids, finding only a few drops of stale coffee and warm canned tomatoes. A daring attempt to draw water from the courtyard well resulted in a devastating barrage of incoming fire, forcing the thirsty gunmen back inside empty-handed. They resorted to drinking the stagnant, foul-smelling liquid remaining in the bottom of small porcelain wash basins, straining the dirty water through their gritted teeth. The foul taste sickened their stomachs, providing minimal relief from the crushing dehydration. Brown ignored the cramping in his gut, focusing entirely on scanning the tree line for the distinct puff of white smoke revealing a sniper's nest. Brown focused entirely on the mechanics of his survival, blocking out the growing despair of his trapped companions. He meticulously cleaned the chamber of his Winchester once again, ensuring the lever mechanism remained free of the fine grit kicked up by the incoming projectiles. He moved from window to window, taking calculated shots at the trench lines to discourage the posse from advancing across the open ground. His shoulder throbbed with deep, painful, dark purple bruises from the repeated recoil of his punishing firearm. He wrapped a torn strip of cloth around the wooden stock to absorb some of the brutal impact. The standoff stretched through the entirety of July 17th, transforming the once comfortable house into a squalid, nerve-wracking prison. The wooden floorboards became slick with spent brass casings, spilled lamp oil, and the men's own sweat. The constant noise, combined with the lack of sleep and severe dehydration, pushed the regulators toward utter exhaustion. McSween sat huddled in a dark corner, clutching a leather-bound Bible, his presence offering zero tactical assistance to the armed gunmen fighting to keep him alive. He prayed audibly, his voice trembling over the roar of the gun battle. The constant, psychological strain tested the limits of every man inside the barricade. The erratic pacing of the unseasoned lawyer grated on the nerves of the hardened cowboys, sparking sharp whispers and tense glares in the darkened hallways. They understood their lives hung by a fraying thread, dependent entirely on their ability to hold the perimeter until the opposing force ran low on ammunition or lost their resolve. Brown maintained a cold, detached demeanor, refusing to engage in the panicked speculation circulating among the younger members of the group. He conserved his energy, breathing slowly and keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon. A dramatic shift in the balance of power occurred on the morning of July 18th. A deep, rhythmic rumbling echoed from the western approach, distinct from the sharp cracks of the ongoing rifle fire. Brown peered through a crack in the window boards, observing a column of uniformed United States cavalry riding into the settlement. Colonel Nathan Dudley led the solemn procession, commanding heavily armed soldiers dispatched from nearby Fort Stanton under the official guise of restoring order to the chaotic valley. The sun glinted off their polished brass buttons and the drawn sabers of the commanding officers. The arrival of the military forces initially sparked a brief surge of hope among the trapped regulators. They believed the presence of federal troops would force the Pepin posse to disperse and end the illegal siege. However, Dudley harbored a deep personal animosity toward Alexander McSween, viewing the lawyer as the primary instigator of the region's unrest. The colonel aligned his troops squarely with the Dolan faction, setting up a massive canvas command tent directly across the street from the residence. He deployed a devastating array of artillery, completely altering the tactical landscape of the standoff. Brown watched in cold realization as the soldiers wheeled a rapid-fire Gatling gun into the center of the dirt road. Next to the menacing multi-barreled weapon, they positioned a 12-pound mountain howitzer, pointing the massive iron bore directly at the front doors of the McSween residence. Dudley issued a stern, booming proclamation demanding the regulators cease firing or face total annihilation from the military cannons. The threat effectively neutralized the defenders, forcing them to hold their fire and watch helplessly while the posse moved freely outside. Engaging the army meant facing charges of treason and guaranteed destruction. Taking full advantage of the military shield, the Dolan gunmen crept much closer to the property during the late afternoon. They utilized the blind spots along the side of the house, staying entirely out of the narrow sightlines available to Brown and the others. The defenders heard the sound of hard boots crunching against the gravel right outside the walls, followed by the scraping of dry wood and the distinct splashing of liquid. The pungent smell of raw kerosene permeated the air, drifting through the shattered windows and settling deeply into the enclosed rooms. The attackers were preparing to burn them out. On the morning of July 19th, the besiegers initiated the final, most devastating phase of their assault. A tightly bound bundle of burning kindling arched over the adobe wall, landing squarely on the wooden trim of the rear kitchen door. The dry timber caught fire swiftly, the flames spreading upward along the door frame and biting hungry into the exposed roof joists. Opaque black smoke began to billow outward, signaling the beginning of the end for the fortified stronghold. The sharp crackle of burning wood joined the continuous roar of the gunfire, creating a terrifying symphony of destruction. The fire crept steadily through the western wing of the house, consuming the dry wooden floorboards and the coarse straw insulation packed within the ceiling cavity. Brown and the regulators retreated from the kitchen, dragging their ammunition crates into the adjacent dining room. The air grew dense and unbreathable, stinging their eyes fiercely and forcing them to tie wet bandanas across their noses and mouths. They coughed violently, their lungs burning as the thick smoke banked down from the ceiling, pushing them closer to the floor in search of clean oxygen. The Pepin posse intensified their gunfire, aiming directly at the exterior doors to prevent the trapped men from escaping the growing inferno. Large bullets tore through the wooden panels, splintering the frames and adding to the chaotic destruction inside the rooms. The roar of the flames grew significantly louder, consuming the structure with an unstoppable, ravenous ferocity. The extreme heat radiated through the interior mud walls, turning the remaining rooms into blistering chambers of torture. Sweat poured from Brown's face, instantly evaporating in the baking atmosphere of the collapsing building. By mid-afternoon, the ravenous fire had consumed half the residence, forcing the 14 men to consolidate in the easternmost rooms. The structural integrity of the building began to rapidly fail, with flaming roof beams crashing down into the burning sections, sending massive showers of bright orange sparks flying through the hallways. Brown kept his rifle fully loaded and ready, staring down the smoke-filled corridor, waiting for the inevitable moment when the attackers would breach the collapsing walls. The immense roar of the blaze drowned out the frantic conversations of his companions. McSween realized the absolute desperation of their situation and attempted to negotiate a formal surrender. He called out from a shattered window, offering to turn himself over to the military forces in exchange for safe passage for his men. Colonel Dudley flatly refused to intervene, citing his strict orders to remain a neutral observer. Despite actively aiming a loaded howitzer at the burning house, the lawyer's desperate pleas went entirely unanswered, leaving the men with a stark, brutal choice between burning alive or facing the firing squad waiting in the dark shadows outside. As dusk approached on July 19th, the flames finally reached the final 2 rooms of the residence. The heat grew so intense that the brass cartridges stored in the men's pockets became too hot to touch comfortably. The remaining oxygen vanished rapidly, replaced entirely by a toxic cloud of burning wood, melting roofing tar, and scorching adobe. The men huddled close to the floorboards, gasping forcefully for the thin layer of clean air lingering just above the dirt foundation. Survival inside the structure was no longer physically possible. A frantic, whispered conference took place in the darkest corner of the final room. Bonnie, Brown, and French mapped out a desperate, suicidal breakout strategy. They would wait for the sun to completely set, using the deep shadows of the rear courtyard to mask their initial movements from the sharpshooters. They planned to burst through the eastern door simultaneously, sprinting across the open ground and vaulting over the rear adobe wall into the dense brush lining the Rio Bonito. The plan relied entirely on speed, surprise, and a massive amount of luck. The timing of the escape required absolute, flawless precision. If they ran too early, the lingering daylight would expose them perfectly to the waiting gunmen. If they waited too long, the burning roof would collapse directly onto their heads, crushing them beneath tons of blazing, massive debris. Brown tightened his grip on his Winchester, checking the chamber one last time in the dim, flickering light of the approaching fire. He braced his legs, his muscles coiled incredibly tight with adrenaline and sheer, uncompromising terror. He focused his mind on the required physical actions, shutting out the surrounding chaos. Total darkness finally fell over the valley, though the blazing inferno of the McSween house illuminated the immediate surrounding area with a harsh, glaring light. At roughly 9 o'clock, the burning ceiling of the adjacent room caved in with a massive crash, sending a large plume of fire, ash, and glowing embers rocketing into the night sky. Bonnie shouted the command to move. The men kicked open the shattered remnants of the eastern door and surged outward into the chaotic night, abandoning the doomed structure and sprinting toward the river. The sudden appearance of the fleeing gunmen triggered an overwhelming volley of incoming fire from the surrounding posse. Dozens of rifles discharged simultaneously, filling the courtyard with a deadly hail of metal projectiles. The air buzzed violently with the sound of flying slugs, kicking up geysers of dirt and striking the wooden fence posts with sharp, cracking impacts. Brown sprinted forward, his legs pumping furiously as he navigated the uneven ground. Alexander McSween emerged from the doorway just behind the first wave of runners. The lawyer froze in the center of the illuminated yard, entirely paralyzed by the terrifying noise. A devastating barrage of bullets struck the lawyer from multiple angles, tearing through his torso and dropping him instantly into the dirt. Harvey Morris, another young member of the Regulators, also caught a fatal projectile during the sprint, collapsing onto the grass near the perimeter fence. Brown ignored the falling bodies, keeping his eyes locked entirely on the low adobe wall separating the yard from the riverbank. He reached the boundary, launching himself upward and tumbling down the opposite side into the muddy weeds. He splashed across the cold, fast-moving water of the Rio Bonito, plunging deep into the heavy timber of the dark hillside, finally escaping the deadly illumination of the fire. The 5-day battle ended in absolute ruin, leaving Henry Newton Brown a hunted fugitive running blindly into the unforgiving wilderness. On October 1st, 1878, a biting northern gale swept across the desolate eastern plains of the New Mexico Territory. It pushed a ragged band of fugitive gunmen toward the flat expanse of the Texas Panhandle. Henry Newton Brown rode in grim silence alongside the surviving remnants of the shattered faction. Their clothing was scorched, faces hardened by the sheer violence of the preceding months. They drove fatigued mounts at a punishing pace, desperate to outrun military patrols scouring the smoldering Pecos Valley. The deep canyons yielded to a featureless horizon, signaling their entrance into the Llano Estacado. This transition marked a shift in survival strategy, forcing them to abandon mountain strongholds for an ocean of dry grass. Navigating the sprawling Texas plains required different skills than fighting in a fortified urban environment. The Llano Estacado presented a formidable barrier lacking natural landmarks, reliable timber, or visible surface water. Men attempting to cross this void without precise knowledge of hidden springs routinely perished beneath the baking sun. Brown and his companions relied on ancient trails worn into the hard dirt by migrating buffalo herds. They traveled primarily under the cover of darkness, utilizing constellations to maintain a steady eastern bearing while avoiding brutal daytime temperatures. The profound silence of the open prairie amplified the sound of creaking saddle leather and the steady thud of unshod hooves against the baked crust of the earth. Thirst quickly escalated into a severe physical threat, stalking the riders across the dusty terrain. Scattered watering holes frequently turned out dry or fouled by the decaying carcasses of wild animals. When canteens ran empty, the men resorted to slicing open the thick pads of local prickly pear cacti with hunting knives. They carefully scraped away sharp needles and chewed the fibrous pulp to extract precious moisture. Agonizing cramps of dehydration tightened their stomachs, testing their resolve as they pushed deeper into the remote wilderness. Sand coated their dry tongues, making speech nearly impossible while scanning the endless horizon for any sign of a green depression indicating a hidden spring. By the early spring of 1879, the isolated group completed their transformation from a politically motivated posse into a highly organized ring of livestock thieves. Without the financial backing of their deceased employer, rustling became the sole method of acquiring currency and sustaining their transient lifestyle. Stealing mature horses offered a faster, more lucrative enterprise than dealing with slow-moving cattle herds. Equines could cover vast distances rapidly, allowing the outlaws to strike a target and vanish across territorial lines long before local ranchers discovered the theft. They targeted isolated corrals, focusing on seizing premium saddle stock and sturdy draft animals capable of fetching high prices. The mechanics of a successful equine raid demanded total silence and flawless coordination. Brown mastered the art of creeping into heavily guarded corrals during the blackest hours of the night. He carried thick burlap sacks, carefully tying the rough fabric securely over the hooves of stolen animals. This crude modification muffled the sharp clattering of iron shoes against the rocky ground. The thieves coaxed the prized stock away from sleeping settlements, maintaining a painfully slow walking pace until they safely cleared the perimeter of the target ranch. The slightest nervous whinny from a startled mare could awaken an entire bunkhouse of armed cowboys, guaranteeing a swift, deadly gunfight in the darkness. Once safely out of earshot, the outlaws spurred the stolen horses into a relentless gallop, driving them toward the safety of remote canyon lands. Securing the livestock only constituted the first phase of the illicit operation. Altering legally, registered ownership marks required swift efficiency with a heated piece of metal. Brown utilized a straight iron rod, heating the tip to a glowing red over a concealed campfire. He pressed the searing metal against the animal's hide, drawing new lines to obscure the original brand. The captive animals kicked against their restraining ropes, the pungent stench of burning hair and scorched flesh filling the narrow canyon walls. Selling the illegitimately acquired herds necessitated establishing a reliable network of unscrupulous buyers operating on the absolute fringes of the western frontier. The thieves drove their disguised livestock north into the rugged valleys of the Canadian River or west toward isolated mining camps of Colorado. Greedy merchants and corrupt ranchers willingly paid solid silver coins for the prime animals, ignoring crude, freshly burned alterations scarring the horses' flanks. This commerce provided the outlaws with enough capital to purchase fresh ammunition, high-quality gear, and temporary shelter in squalid settlements. They traded their stolen property rapidly, refusing to linger in any single location long enough for pursuing lawmen to track their movements. The physical toll of this continuous lawless existence steadily eroded the gunmen's overall health and fundamental sanity. They slept in deep, muddy arroyos or beneath the minimal shelter of overhanging rock formations, constantly exposed to shifting extremes of the open plains. Torrential rainstorms frequently turned the panhandle dirt into a thick, clinging paste that ruined leather boots and rotted the stitching on heavy saddles. They subsisted on a monotonous, nutritionally devoid diet of tough jerky and stale beans, suffering from chronic malnutrition and recurring bouts of intestinal distress. Minor cuts frequently turned into inflamed weeping sores due to the complete lack of basic hygiene or clean bandages. Living under the constant pressure of active arrest warrants generated severe paranoia within the small band of fugitives. Every unknown rider approaching on the horizon triggered a frantic scramble for cover and the metallic clatter of cocking rifles. They trusted no one outside their tight-knit circle, viewing every passing stranger as a potential bounty hunter or undercover military scout. The shared trauma of previous battles forged a strong bond, yet the stress of endless evasion slowly began to fracture their unity. Bitter arguments erupted over the division of stolen funds, the selection of next targets, and the direction of their nomadic travels. The threat of internal violence loomed large around their isolated campfires. William Bonney increasingly desired to remain within the familiar boundaries of the New Mexico territory. He maintained deep, personal ties to local Hispanic communities, relying heavily on their generous hospitality and willingness to hide him from the law. The young outlaw thrived on the attention and notoriety he received among the impoverished sheep farmers of the Pecos Valley. Brown possessed a far more pragmatic view of their dire situation, recognizing the absolute futility of lingering in a region saturated with armed posses dedicated solely to their destruction. He refused to tie his own survival to the reckless vanity and sentimental attachments of his younger companion. During the late autumn months of 1879, Brown officially severed his ties with the core group of remaining fugitives. The parting occurred without violence or profound animosity, driven entirely by a fundamental disagreement regarding long-term survival strategies. Bonney turned his horse back toward the dangerous, familiar canyons of his youth, choosing a path that would ultimately ensure his violent demise. Brown pointed his mount eastward, riding alone into the vast, sprawling cattle empire of the Texas Panhandle, seeking total anonymity amidst the booming agricultural industry. The separation marked the final dissolution of the lethal alliance forged during the bloody street battles of the prior year. The Canadian River Valley presented a dramatic contrast to the barren plains, offering rolling hills of rich grass and reliable flowing water sources. Massive, legally chartered cattle operations dominated this region, employing hundreds of tough riders to manage herds numbering in the tens of thousands. Brown understood that a man willing to perform grueling manual labor could easily vanish within the ranks of these sprawling outfits. He deliberately altered his physical appearance, growing a thick beard and swapping his distinct customized gear for standard, severely worn ranching equipment. He discarded his heavily ornamented sombrero for a plain, battered felt hat, erasing his notorious identity. Approaching the headquarters of a sprawling panhandle ranch, Brown sought honest employment for the first time in years. The foreman, a hardened veteran of the long trails, asked no questions regarding the drifter's past, focusing entirely on assessing his physical competence. Brown demonstrated his skills with a coiled hemp rope and his unwavering ability to control a volatile, unbroken Mustang. He secured a position on the payroll, trading the high-stakes thrills of rustling for the back-breaking reality of a legitimate cowboy. He handed over a false name to the timekeeper, settling into the crowded, noisy bunkhouse alongside dozens of other transient laborers. The daily routine on the major panhandle ranches demanded an incredible tolerance for pain and absolute submission to the elements. Work commenced hours before sunrise, initiated by the gruff shouts of the camp cook and a meager breakfast of bitter coffee and dense biscuits. Brown spent up to 16 hours a day in the saddle, tracking stray cattle through dense thickets of thorny mesquite and pulling mired calves from treacherous sucking mud bogs. The massive scale of the operation meant spending weeks at a time away from the main bunkhouse, sleeping beneath the open sky on the hard, unyielding ground. The physical exertion left him drained by nightfall. Working the expansive open range exposed the riders to the full, devastating fury of the incoming winter. By December of 1880, the temperature plummeted drastically, ushering in one of the most brutal seasons recorded on the Texas frontier. Savage northern winds howled across the flat terrain, driving thick curtains of blinding white snow ahead of them. The sheer velocity of the gales made standing upright virtually impossible, forcing the men to seek refuge deep within twisting, narrow ravines carving through the landscape. The swirling drifts quickly erased all established trails, turning the familiar valley into an unrecognizable frozen wasteland. Surviving these intense blizzards required extreme measures and endurance. Brown and his fellow cowboys huddled closely together beneath heavy canvas tarps, sharing their limited body heat to stave off fatal hypothermia. They tied their horses securely to the thick trunks of stunted cottonwood trees, providing the animals with whatever meager shelter the terrain offered. The blinding snow completely obliterated all visibility, trapping the men in isolated pockets of freezing misery for days on end. Firewood proved incredibly scarce, leaving them reliant on their own physical resilience and the inadequate insulation of their stiff, icy wool coats. The freezing temperatures inflicted severe, permanent damage on exposed extremities. Frostbite claimed the tips of fingers and toes, turning the living flesh a sickly, pale white before blackening into dead, necrotic tissue. Men stuffed dry prairie grass into their boots in a desperate attempt to insulate their freezing feet from the frozen ground. Brown wrapped thick wool scarves tightly around his face, leaving only a tiny slit for his eyes to prevent the icy wind from causing permanent blindness. The agonizing sting of the cold penetrated deep into their bones, a continuous gnawing pain that offered no reprieve until the storm eventually broke. When the howling winds finally subsided, the devastating aftermath of the storm revealed itself across the pristine white landscape. The massive cattle herds, unable to secure adequate forage beneath the deep snowdrifts, suffered catastrophic losses. Thousands of frozen carcasses dotted the valley, their stiff legs pointing rigidly toward the gray sky. The survivors huddled together in miserable, starving groups, their ribs pressing sharply against their heavy winter coats. The cowboys faced the grueling task of assessing the damage, riding through the deep powder to tally the financial destruction inflicted upon their wealthy employers. The sheer scale of death was staggering. Spring thaws arrived late in 1881, turning the frozen earth into a vast, impassable sea of thick, treacherous mud. The melting snow revealed the true scale of the agricultural disaster, with rotting bovine corpses poisoning the shallow streams and filling the air with a horrific stench. The immense financial blow crippled the major ranching operations, forcing the wealthy owners to drastically reduce their workforce. Mass layoffs swept through the Canadian River Valley, leaving hundreds of skilled riders suddenly unemployed and adrift. The thriving cattle empire temporarily collapsed under the weight of the environmental catastrophe, throwing the regional economy into absolute chaos. Finding himself without a steady wage or a secure bunkhouse, Brown faced a critical juncture in his violent trajectory. Returning to a life of full-time rustling offered a quick influx of cash, but he recognized the increasing danger of the illicit trade. The Panhandle ranchers, enraged by their recent losses, began hiring ruthless bands of armed detectives to hunt down known thieves. The frontier was rapidly modernizing, bringing telegraph lines and coordinated law enforcement efforts that made disappearing significantly more difficult. The era of the unchecked nomadic outlaw was drawing to a bloody, inevitable close. Brown packed his meager belongings, saddled his horse, and gravitated toward the scattered, rowdy settlements dotting the region. These isolated towns served as vital supply hubs and entertainment centers for the transient population of buffalo hunters, freighters, and out-of-work cowboys. He rode into the muddy streets of Tascosa, a notorious haven for outlaws and hardened drifters. The settlement consisted of crude wooden structures and canvas tents, offering a stark, violent contrast to the quiet isolation of the open range. The stench of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and raw sewage permeated the narrow alleyways between the makeshift buildings. The atmosphere inside the Tascosa saloons hummed with dangerous, unpredictable energy. Unemployed men squandered their remaining silver coins on cheap, burning whiskey and rigged card games, their frustrations frequently boiling over into brutal physical altercations. Brown navigated this volatile environment with a cold, detached awareness, securing a dark corner table and observing the chaos unfolding around him. He noted the complete absence of any formal authority as the local constables proved incapable of controlling the armed, intoxicated crowds. The lawmen rarely intervened in the frequent brawls, preferring to collect the bodies after the gunfire ceased. Gunfire erupted with alarming frequency within the crowded gambling halls, settling trivial disputes over spilled drinks or perceived insults. Brown watched men bleed out on the sawdust-covered floors, the surrounding patrons barely pausing their games to acknowledge the fresh corpses. He kept his own weapons meticulously cleaned and loaded, his hand resting constantly near the worn grips of his revolver. His quiet, imposing demeanor and the cold, unblinking intensity of his stare effectively deterred most potential challengers from testing his patience. He projected an aura of calculated lethality, ensuring the drunken crowds gave him a wide, respectful berth. To sustain himself, Brown engaged in occasional short-term contracts, guarding valuable freight shipments traveling across the perilous territory. Merchants willingly paid a premium for a rifleman possessing his documented lethal proficiency. He rode atop heavily laden wagons, his Winchester resting firmly across his lap, scanning the treacherous ravines for potential ambushers. The work provided steady income without the grueling physical toll of ranching or the constant, paranoid evasion of rustling. He executed these duties with ruthless efficiency, ensuring the safe delivery of the cargo while maintaining a safe, detached distance from his wealthy employers. Despite the steady pay, the transient nature of freight guarding offered zero long-term stability or potential for advancement. Brown grew weary of the endless miles of dust and the constant exposure to the brutal Texas elements. He observed the wealthy merchants and successful saloon owners amassing small fortunes within the settlements, recognizing a stark disparity in the frontier hierarchy. Those who controlled the flow of commerce reaped the ultimate rewards, while the men performing the manual labor and the violent enforcement remained utterly dispensable. He desired a position that offered both financial security and a measure of civic respect. A subtle shift occurred within the social dynamics of the Panhandle towns as the year progressed. The prominent business owners, tired of the continuous property damage and lost revenue caused by the rampant lawlessness, began seeking capable individuals to impose order. They required men possessing a total willingness to inflict lethal force upon their enemies, individuals untroubled by moral constraints or legal technicalities. Brown fit this specific deadly criteria perfectly, his reputation forged in the bloody street battles of the New Mexico conflict. The town councils cared nothing for a man's past, provided he could accurately aim a firearm. Sitting quietly in a dim Tascosa saloon during the late summer of 1881, Brown pondered the potential benefits of pinning a piece of tin to his chest. He understood the profound irony of a wanted fugitive assuming the role of a peace officer. However, the position offered a steady, reliable salary, a warm bed, and a legally sanctioned outlet for his violent skills. It provided a distinct level of authority and respect previously unavailable to a drifting cowhand or a hunted horse thief. The badge represented a shield against his former crimes, a mechanism to reinvent himself completely. He recognized the inherent dangers of the profession, knowing full well the short life expectancy of frontier lawmen. He had personally participated in the brutal assassination of a county sheriff, fully comprehending the massive target a badge painted on a man's back. Yet the alternative of freezing in a muddy trench or swinging from a vigilante's rope held far less appeal. The lawmen dictated the terms of the violence, controlling the flow of the conflict rather than constantly reacting to the maneuvers of pursuing posses. It was a calculated risk, weighing the constant threat of death against a comfortable existence. Rumors circulated through the bar rooms regarding highly lucrative opportunities opening up further north, up the long, dusty cattle trails leading into Kansas. The booming cow towns anchoring the major railroad lines required extremely tough, uncompromising marshals to handle the massive influx of heavily armed Texas riders. These thriving hubs offered significantly higher wages and far more luxurious accommodations than the squalid settlements of the Panhandle. The prospect of leaving the harsh Texas environment behind firmly took root in his mind. He envisioned a future where he issued the arrest warrants instead of constantly fleeing from them. By the closing weeks of 1881, Henry Newton Brown finalized his decision to abandon the nomadic, grueling existence of the open plains. He purchased a fresh, sturdy mount, restocked his ammunition pouches, and secured his heavy canvas bedroll behind the saddle. Turning his back on the muddy streets of Tascosa and the frozen graves of the devastating winter, he rode north. He moved steadily toward the violent, prosperous railroad hubs, ready to transition from a hunted outlaw into a lethal enforcer of the law. The bitter winds of Texas faded behind him, replaced by the promise of Kansas gold. On January 2nd, 1882, a freezing wind swept through the Canadian River Valley, chilling the scattered wooden buildings of Tascosa. This remote Texas settlement served as the primary supply hub for sprawling cattle operations dominating the region. The community possessed a rough, unfinished appearance, featuring crude adobe structures and false-fronted timber stores lining a single, wide dirt thoroughfare. Henry Newton Brown walked along the uneven boardwalks, observing the transient population of freighters, merchants, and hardened drovers navigating the winter mud. He sought a permanent position, tired of temporary guard duty and the grueling physical demands of open-range ranching under the harsh sun. The local economy thrived on the immense bovine herds passing through the territory. Riders from the extensive ranching syndicates descended upon the community after weeks of isolated, punishing labor on the plains. They arrived with full pockets, desperate to spend. Their accumulated wages on whiskey, gambling, and companionship. This sudden influx of currency transformed the quiet post into a chaotic, dangerous center of debauchery. Saloons operated around the clock, filling the cold air with piano music and cheap cigar smoke, generating substantial profits while simultaneously breeding constant, savage conflict among the intoxicated patrons. Maintaining order in Oldham County rested on the shoulders of Sheriff Cape Willingham. This seasoned officer struggled to police a jurisdiction spanning thousands of square miles of untamed wilderness. Willingham recognized the impossibility of securing the vast ranges alone, requiring capable deputies to patrol the turbulent, mud-slicked streets of the county seat to protect the residents. The municipal council demanded a reduction in property damage and a safer environment for legitimate commerce to flourish. The sheriff needed personnel possessing profound physical courage and a demonstrated willingness to confront armed, belligerent crowds without hesitation. Willingham observed the newcomer operating within the crowded gambling halls, taking careful note of his cold, calculating demeanor. He saw a man who never consumed alcohol, always positioned his back against a solid wall, and kept his hands resting near his weapons. The sheriff recognized the distinct predatory awareness cultivated only by individuals who had survived extensive frontier combat. Seeking to harness this lethal capability for civic duty, the chief lawman approached the silent observer and offered him a monthly salary to wear a tin star. Accepting the offer represented a profound shift in trajectory for the former fugitive. Brown raised his right hand, swore a binding oath to uphold the laws of Texas, and pinned the silver shield onto his canvas vest. The weight of the badge felt unfamiliar, a stark contrast to his previous years spent actively evading legal authority. He transitioned from a hunted outlaw into a sanctioned enforcer, granted the power to arrest, detain, and utilize force on behalf of the state. This new role provided a legal shield, validating his aggressive tendencies under the guise of public safety. The new deputy commenced his daily patrols with a rigid, uncompromising routine. He walked the length of the main street repeatedly, his heavy boots striking the wooden planks with deliberate, measured steps. He inspected the dark alleyways separating the drinking establishments, searching for unconscious drunks or potential ambushers hiding in the shadows. His presence alone altered the atmosphere within the taverns, often silencing boisterous conversations as he stepped through the swinging doors. He scanned the faces of the patrons, memorizing the features of known troublemakers and assessing the threat level of every armed individual in the room. His armament shifted slightly to accommodate his new responsibilities. While he retained his Winchester rifle for long-range engagements, his primary tool became the forged iron Colt revolver hanging low on his right thigh. He kept the holster tied down tightly with a leather thong, ensuring the weapon would not snag during a rapid draw. The cylinder held 5 loaded brass cartridges, the hammer resting securely over an empty chamber to prevent accidental discharges. He meticulously cleaned the steel components and oiled the internal springs daily, demanding absolute mechanical perfection from his equipment. Trail hands arriving from the distant ranges viewed the peace officer with deep suspicion and open hostility. These young, aggressive men resented any form of authority attempting to restrict their hard-earned recreation. They tested the boundaries constantly, pushing acceptable limits by firing their firearms into the air or riding their horses directly onto the wooden boardwalks. They hurled insults and challenges, hoping to provoke a reaction and assess the mettle of the quiet enforcer. Brown absorbed the verbal abuse without changing his expression, waiting for a clear violation of the statutes before intervening. His approach to keeping the peace relied heavily on sudden, overwhelming physical force. When a rider crossed the line from boisterous behavior to active destruction or assault, Brown acted with ruthless efficiency. He rarely issued verbal warnings, preferring to close the distance rapidly and neutralize the threat before the offender could formulate a response. He understood that engaging in a drawn-out argument with an intoxicated, armed man only increased the probability of a fatal shooting. His goal was total compliance, achieved through the rapid application of blunt trauma. The first significant test of his authority occurred inside a crowded gambling tent on a Friday night. A severely intoxicated drover from the LX ranch lost a substantial sum of silver at a faro table and accused the dealer of cheating. The cowboy drew a hunting knife, driving the steel blade deep into the wooden surface and demanding his money returned. Patrons scrambled away from the dispute, creating a wide circle of empty space around the enraged loser. Brown stepped through the canvas entrance, his eyes locking onto the furious man standing over the terrified dealer. Closing the distance in 3 swift strides, the lawman ignored the sharp blade protruding from the table. The drover turned, raising his fists and shouting a slurred threat. Instead of drawing his revolver, Brown stepped inside the man's guard, launching a devastating right cross directly into the cowboy's jaw. The impact sounded like a dense wooden club striking a side of beef. The force of the blow shattered the man's lower mandible, sending a spray of blood and broken teeth across the green felt of the gambling surface. The injured instigator collapsed backward, his head bouncing hard against the compacted dirt floor. Brown did not pause to assess the damage. He reached down, grabbing the unconscious patron by the collar of his thick wool coat. He dragged the limp body out of the tent, hauling him across the muddy street toward the county lockup. The surrounding gamblers watched in stunned silence, shocked by the sheer speed and brutality of the response. The altercation ended in seconds, leaving no room for debate or escalation. The Tascosa jail consisted of a small, windowless stone building featuring thick iron bars and a solid oak door. Brown hauled his bleeding prisoner inside, tossing him onto a rigid wooden cot in the corner of the dark cell. He stripped the man of his weapons, locking the heavy iron bolt from the outside. The facility offered zero comfort, lacking heat, clean water, or basic sanitation. Inmates suffered through freezing nights and sweltering days, left to endure the painful consequences of their actions in miserable isolation. Word of the swift beating spread rapidly among the various ranch camps dotting the valley. The cattlemen realized the new deputy would not tolerate defiance, yet this knowledge only fueled their resentment. They viewed the tactics as excessively harsh and dishonorable, preferring a fair, standing fistfight over a crushing ambush. A dangerous undercurrent of anger began to build against the lawman, with groups of riders actively conspiring to catch him off guard. The tension in the saloons thickened whenever the badge-wearer entered the room. A second major confrontation erupted during the early spring of 1882. 4 hired hands from the frying pan outfit decided to shoot out the glass lanterns illuminating the exterior of a local dance hall. The shattering glass showered the wooden porch, sending terrified musicians and patrons diving for cover. Brown heard the gunshots from the sheriff's office and sprinted toward the commotion, his hand resting firmly on the grip of his Colt. He rounded the corner, confronting the quartet as they reloaded their smoking weapons. Outnumbered and facing armed opponents, the deputy chose a highly aggressive tactic to assert control. He drew his dense revolver, but instead of cocking the hammer to fire, he flipped the weapon in his hand, grasping the steel barrel tightly. He charged the closest vandal, swinging the solid iron handle of the gun in a wide, vicious arc. The metal butt struck the man's temple with a sickening crunch, dropping him instantly to the wooden planks. The sudden extreme violence stunned the remaining 3 participants. Before the others could raise their rifles, Brown pivoted, driving his left fist deeply into the stomach of the second man. As the cowboy doubled over in pain, the lawman brought his right knee upward, smashing it into the descending face. The cartilage in the man's nose gave way under the weighty strike, blood pouring freely down his chin and soaking his shirt. The remaining 2 riders dropped their long guns, raising their empty hands in the air, terrified by the savage efficiency of the lone enforcer. Securing the prisoners, he marched them at gunpoint down the center of the thoroughfare toward the stone lockup. He left the 2 severely injured men bleeding on the porch, requiring the local physician to stitch their lacerations and set their broken bones. The physical damage inflicted by the forged iron revolver frame proved severe, leaving deep, permanent scars and lingering neurological issues for the victim. This practice of pistol whipping became his trademark method of subduing resistant targets, earning him a terrifying reputation throughout the territory. While his uncompromising methods effectively quelled the rowdy behavior in the streets, They generated intense political blowback for Sheriff Willingham. The sprawling ranching syndicates wielded immense financial and political power within the Texas Panhandle. The wealthy ranch managers did not appreciate a local officer inflicting permanent physical damage on their skilled labor force. A drover with a shattered jaw or a fractured skull could not work cattle, costing the syndicates valuable time and money. Complaints began piling up on the sheriff's desk, demanding a rein on the aggressive deputy. Willingham attempted to counsel his subordinate, urging a more measured approach to policing the settlements. He explained the delicate economic balance of Tascosa, emphasizing that the town needed the cowboys to spend their wages, not lay unconscious in the local infirmary. The sheriff suggested using verbal commands, issuing fines, or simply allowing minor infractions to pass without violent intervention. He needed a peacekeeper capable of diffusing tense situations, not a combatant looking for an excuse to crush skulls. The deputy completely rejected the advice, viewing any display of leniency as a fatal weakness. He argued that the hardened trail hands respected nothing but superior force, and backing down would only invite further challenges and eventual assassination. His temperament, forged in prior territorial conflicts, prevented him from tolerating disrespect or insubordination. He refused to compromise his survival instincts to appease the financial concerns of distant cattle barons. The friction between the two lawmen escalated rapidly as the summer approached. The breaking point occurred during the sweltering heat of late July. A massive brawl erupted inside the largest saloon in town, involving over a dozen men from rival cattle outfits. Chairs flew through the air, glass bottles shattered against the mahogany bar, and men grappled fiercely on the sawdust-covered floor. The sheer scale of the conflict threatened to consume the entire establishment, causing the owner to flee into the street and scream for the authorities. Brown arrived on the scene entirely alone, facing a chaotic mass of swinging fists and kicking boots. Instead of waiting for backup, the solitary enforcer waded directly into the center of the melee. He drew his revolver, grasping it by the barrel, and began striking indiscriminately at any man within reach. He delivered crushing blows to the backs of heads, shoulders, and ribs, leaving a trail of groaning, bleeding cowboys in his wake. His face remained an impassive mask of cold concentration, as he systematically dismantled the riot through sheer, uncompromising brutality. He broke a collarbone with a downward strike, stepping over the writhing victim to reach his next target. The violent intervention successfully ended the clash, leaving the interior of the saloon completely wrecked. 7 men lay unconscious or severely injured on the floor, their blood mixing with the spilled alcohol and broken glass. The surviving combatants fled out the rear exits, nursing bruised ribs and cut faces. Brown stood amidst the carnage, his knuckles bleeding and his chest heaving slightly from the intense physical exertion. He holstered his weapon, wiped the sweat from his brow, and walked back out onto the sun-baked street. The aftermath of the saloon brawl proved disastrous for the town's delicate political balance. The injured men included several high-ranking foremen from the most prominent ranches in the territory. The owners threatened to boycott the settlement entirely, promising to drive their herds to alternative railheads and completely bankrupt the local merchants. The municipal council held an emergency meeting, presenting Sheriff Willingham with an absolute ultimatum. They demanded the removal of the overly aggressive deputy, refusing to tolerate any further disruptions to their lucrative commerce. Willingham summoned his enforcer into the small, cramped office at the front of the stone jail. The sheriff sat behind a scarred wooden desk, looking tired and thoroughly defeated by the relentless pressure. He acknowledged the undeniable courage and the total success in pacifying the dangerous elements of the town. However, he clearly stated that the settlement simply could not afford the financial consequences of the extreme methods utilized. The community required a peacekeeper, not an executioner wielding a forged iron club. The chief lawman extended his right hand, formally demanding the return of the tin star. He offered a full month's severance pay in silver coins, hoping to soften the blow of the dismissal and avoid a physical confrontation. Willingham kept his left hand resting carefully out of sight below the desk, fully aware of the lethal capabilities possessed by the man standing before him. The small room felt incredibly dense, filled with unspoken tension and the smell of stale tobacco. Brown absorbed the command without a single word of protest or a flicker of anger. He understood the transactional nature of his employment and recognized that his utility to the town had officially expired. He reached up, unpinning the silver badge from his canvas vest, and dropped it onto the scarred wooden desk. The metal star landed with a sharp final clatter, severing his brief, violent tenure as a Texas lawman. He scooped the silver coins into his leather pouch, turned on his heel, and walked out the door. Returning to his rented room, the former deputy methodically packed his limited belongings into his canvas saddlebags. He cleaned his Colt revolver and his Winchester rifle, ensuring both weapons functioned flawlessly for the long journey ahead. He felt no regret regarding his actions in the settlement, knowing his brutality had kept him alive in an unforgiving environment. He understood that his specific brand of justice held no place in a developing hub prioritizing merchant profits over absolute order. On a crisp morning in late 1882, Henry Newton Brown mounted his horse and rode slowly out of Tascosa. He did not look back at the crude buildings or the dusty thoroughfare where he had broken so many bones. He turned his mount northward, setting his sights on the distant borders of Kansas. Rumors of booming cow towns and highly paid marshal positions filled his thoughts, drawing him toward an environment where his lethal skills might finally be fully appreciated and rewarded. July 1882. Henry Newton Brown crossed the border from the Indian Territory into the state of Kansas, arriving at the booming settlement of Caldwell. The journey north along the Chisholm Trail exposed him to columns of driven longhorns, their hooves churning the dry prairie dirt into a blinding dust cloud. Caldwell sat positioned securely on the southern boundary line, acting as the primary receiving hub for sprawling Texas cattle drives. The town possessed a grid of wooden commercial buildings, large holding stockyards, and extensive railroad loading pens. The settlement earned the title of the Border Queen due to its strategic geographic location and financial output. 3 distinct railroad lines converged on the eastern edge of the community, providing the essential transportation infrastructure required to move raw beef to eastern markets. Locomotives blew thick black coal smoke into the sky, their heavy iron wheels screeching against steel rails day and night. Wagons loaded tightly with provisions navigated the deeply rutted dirt streets, the rough drivers cracking long leather whips over the backs of straining draft horses. Continuous commerce generated wealth for local bankers, prominent store owners, and saloon proprietors operating within the city limits. This concentrated prosperity acted as a magnet for transient laborers, professional gamblers, and hardened criminals seeking easy currency. The core of Caldwell's expanding economy relied on the hundreds of trail-weary cowboys arriving every single day. These aggressive men spent weeks pushing stubborn cattle across flooded rivers and arid plains. Upon reaching the Kansas railhead, they received their seasonal wages in stamped silver coins and promptly sought unrestrained recreation. The commercial district featured numerous crowded drinking establishments, gambling halls, and rowdy dance pavilions designed to extract the drovers' earnings. Establishments like the Red Light Saloon operated around the clock, serving harsh, unaged whiskey and hosting poker games on green felt tables. The combination of physical exhaustion, excessive alcohol consumption, and well-armed patrons created a volatile civic atmosphere. Violence erupted on the dusty streets of Caldwell with terrifying, predictable frequency. Disagreements over rigged card games or bitter regional rivalries routinely escalated into lethal gunfights. Local law enforcement struggled constantly to maintain basic public order against the overwhelming numbers of belligerent, intoxicated riders. The casualty rate among the city marshals stood at an unprecedented high. Previous officers, including George Flatt, Mike Meager, and John Wilson, had all met bloody ends while attempting to police the chaotic thoroughfares. The local cemetery expanded rapidly, filled with fresh graves marked by crude wooden crosses indicating men who died from sudden gunshot wounds. The mortality rate severely deterred qualified individuals from accepting the dangerous position of chief peace officer. The Caldwell City Council, comprised of wealthy business owners and prominent livestock brokers, grew increasingly desperate to stabilize their town. They recognized that the unchecked, rampant lawlessness threatened lucrative railroad contracts and strongly discouraged permanent civilian settlement. Mayor Mike Colson convened frequent tense meetings in the back rooms of the local bank, searching for a viable solution to the continuous bloodshed. The council members required a man possessing uncompromising lethality, an individual unfazed by the terrifying reputation of the Texas trailhands. They needed a hardened enforcer willing to utilize extreme violence to protect the financial interests of the community. Traditional law enforcement methods involving warrants and peaceful arrests had proven ineffective in this unforgiving environment. During the hottest weeks of July 1882, Henry Newton, Brown tied his horse to a wooden hitching post outside the Caldwell mayor's office. He walked inside, his boots thickly coated in pale Kansas dust, and presented himself as a candidate for the vacant positions. Mayor Colson assessed the quiet, equipped drifter standing before his desk. He noted the worn grips of the Colt revolver strapped to Brown's right thigh, and the unblinking intensity of his stare. The mayor asked very few questions regarding the applicant's past actions in New Mexico or Texas, focusing entirely on his willingness to confront armed resistance. The town possessed zero interest in a man's prior criminal record, provided he could accurately deliver fatal gunfire on command. The municipal council officially hired Brown, assigning him the role of assistant marshal. He would serve directly under a newly appointed chief named Bat Carr. Carr possessed a respectable reputation as a capable civic administrator, but he lacked the ruthless killer instinct required to dominate the violent saloon crowds. The council designed this two-man hierarchy to utilize Carr for organizational duties while deploying Brown as the primary instrument of physical force. They issued the new assistant a shiny brass badge, officially granting him the legal authority to enforce municipal ordinances across the settlement. Brown accepted the polished shield, pinning it securely to the left side of his canvas vest. Brown began his daily patrols along Main Street, methodically familiarizing himself with the chaotic layout of the commercial district. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his calloused hands resting near his loaded weapons. He memorized the precise locations of the narrow alleyways separating the wooden buildings, identifying potential ambush points and rapid escape routes. He stepped into the crowded, smoke-filled saloons, standing silently near the entrances and scanning the flushed faces of the patrons. The noise level inside these establishments frequently reached a deafening roar, with loud piano music clashing against the shouts of drunken gamblers. Brown ignored the sensory overload, focusing on identifying the subtle physical cues indicating impending violence. His enforcement methodology relied heavily on swift aggression designed to neutralize threats before they could fully materialize. Municipal statutes firmly mandated that all incoming cowboys surrender their firearms upon entering the city limits. This unpopular gun ban generated immense friction between the authorities and the trailhands, who viewed their weapons as essential tools of survival. Brown stationed himself near the primary southern entry points, confronting the incoming riders as they crossed into the legal jurisdiction. He demanded their gun belts with a low, unyielding voice, offering absolutely no room for debate or argument. He stood perfectly still, his right hand hovering mere inches above the grip of his own revolver, challenging the riders to test his resolve. Most drovers, exhausted from the punishing trail and intimidated by the cold confidence radiating from the new assistant marshal, complied without incident. They handed over their heavy leather belts, receiving a small brass claim ticket in return. Brown carried the confiscated weapons to a secure storage room inside the local jail. He returned the confiscated arms only when the cowboys mounted their horses to leave the territory. However, a significant portion of the transient population actively resisted the disarmament policy. These hardened individuals, emboldened by their large numbers and fueled by cheap alcohol, flatly refused to surrender their personal property to a stranger. They viewed the local ordinances as an intolerable infringement on their liberties and actively sought to challenge the new enforcer. During the second week of August 1882, a dangerous confrontation erupted outside the Lone Star Saloon. A large, belligerent Texan, accompanied by a group of fully equipped associates, blatantly ignored the strict firearm restriction. They rode their horses directly onto the wooden boardwalk, shouting slurred obscenities and firing their revolvers into the clear summer sky. The thick projectiles shattered the wooden awnings overhead, sending jagged splinters raining down on the terrified pedestrians below. The sharp sound of the gunfire echoed loudly down the main thoroughfare, signaling a direct public challenge to the authority of the Caldwell marshals. Local business owners scrambled to lock their sturdy doors. Brown heard the commotion from the marshal's office and sprinted toward the source of the disturbance. He rounded the corner of the brick bank building, his Winchester rifle gripped firmly in his hands. He assessed the tactical situation instantly, noting the 4 armed men positioned aggressively on the elevated boardwalk. Marshal Carr arrived mere moments later, standing several paces behind his assistant, his face pale and his hands shaking visibly. Carr attempted to shout verbal commands over the noise of the gathering crowd, ordering the cowboys to drop their weapons and surrender peacefully. The Texans responded with raucous laughter and fresh strings of profanity, aiming their smoking revolvers directly at the 2 peace officers. Brown ignored his superior's desperate attempts at negotiation, understanding perfectly that verbal warnings held zero value against intoxicated combatants. He raised his Winchester, pressing the smooth wooden stock tightly against his right shoulder, and aligned the iron sights squarely on the broad chest of the primary instigator. He did not issue a single verbal command to drop the weapons. He simply pulled the trigger. The rifle discharged with a thunderous roar. A thick brass cartridge flew backward out of the open breech. The solid copper slug struck the large Texan directly in the center of his sternum, shattering the bone and tearing a gaping hole through his vital organs. The physical impact lifted the man off his boots, throwing him violently backward through the glass window of the saloon. The uncompromising application of deadly force stunned the remaining 3 cowboys. Their arrogant laughter ceased instantly, replaced by paralyzing terror as they stared at the shattered glass and the bleeding corpse of their companion. Before they could raise their own weapons to return fire, Brown aggressively worked the lever of his Winchester, chambering a fresh round with a loud metallic clatter. He pivoted slightly on his heel, aiming the smoking steel barrel directly at the second closest rider. The clear, undeniable threat of imminent death shattered their previous resolve. The 3 men dropped their revolvers onto the wooden planks, raising their empty hands high above their heads and surrendering to the lone assistant marshal. Brown kept his rifle leveled steadily at the surrendered men. He instructed Carr to gather the discarded weapons from the ground. The assistant ordered the 3 surviving cowboys to lift the heavy bleeding body of their friend and carry it down the dusty street to the local undertaker. He marched the prisoners at gunpoint toward the sturdy stone jail, locking them securely inside a dark, unventilated cell to await formal trial. The swift, unhesitating execution of the instigator sent a shockwave through the transient population of Caldwell. The visiting trail hands realized that the new lawman would not engage in fair fights or prolonged arguments. The brutal incident highlighted the stark contrast between the two men currently wearing the brass badges. Marshal Bat Carr possessed a fundamental reluctance to utilize lethal force, constantly preferring to seek peaceful resolutions even when facing gun-toting opposition. This hesitation proved exceptionally dangerous in the volatile environment of the Border Queen. The city council observed the brief confrontation from the safety of their second-story windows, noting that Brown's brutal efficiency had successfully prevented a full-scale riot. They recognized clearly that the assistant marshal held the true power on the streets. Wealthy merchants began directing their complaints and their generous financial bonuses directly to the younger, significantly more lethal enforcer. Throughout the autumn months of 1882, Brown continued to pacify the settlement through a relentless campaign of calculated intimidation and physical trauma. When confronting belligerent drunks who posed no lethal threat, he utilized the heavy forged iron frame of his Colt revolver as a blunt instrument. He approached unarmed troublemakers from behind, swinging the solid metal handle downward with crushing force. The heavy steel struck skulls with sickening hollow cracks. This action dropped large men to the dirt without a single shot fired. He frequently dragged unconscious, bleeding offenders through the thick mud by their boots, depositing them roughly onto the hard floor of the jail cell to recover from their head injuries. The sheer brutality of his methods effectively deterred the vast majority of the visiting cowboys from causing further disturbances. Crowded saloons grew noticeably quieter, the rampant celebratory gunfire ceased entirely, and the overall volume of municipal property damage plummeted. The merchants rejoiced openly as their fragile storefronts remained intact. Brown essentially imposed a rigid peace upon the settlement, ruling the thoroughfares through the certainty of severe physical punishment. He walked the boardwalks with a slow, predatory grace, his cold stare causing armed groups of men to quickly step aside and drastically lower their voices in his presence. Changing weather patterns signaled the final end of the primary cattle season. By November 1882, the freezing northern winds returned forcefully to the Kansas plains, driving the vast herds southward and drastically reducing the number of transient laborers residing in the town. The heavy, clinging mud of the unpaved streets froze solid, turning the deep wagon ruts into dangerous, ankle-breaking traps. Saloons burned immense amounts of raw coal to keep their remaining patrons warm, sending thick columns of black smoke rising steadily into the pale winter sky. The chaotic energy of the summer months dissipated, replaced by a tense, fragile calm enforced strictly by the local lawman. Recognizing his own unsuitability for the grueling demands of the position, Bat Carr formally submitted his resignation to the city council in early December 1882. Carr cited the severe mental stress and the lingering threat of assassination as his primary reasons for abandoning the badge. The mayor and the assembled council members accepted the resignation without a single word of protest, viewing it as an inevitable and necessary transition of power. They understood perfectly that Caldwell required a man who fully embraced the violence, rather than one who merely tolerated it. The council swiftly convened a special session to officially restructure the municipal law enforcement hierarchy. On the second week of December 1882, Mayor Colson formally promoted Henry Newton Brown. The new title of Chief Marshal of Caldwell included a substantial increase in his monthly salary, a significant portion of the collected fines, and autonomous control over the hiring of subordinate officers. Brown traded his brass assistant shield for the larger solid silver star, marking the highest law enforcement authority in the entire jurisdiction. He had successfully transitioned from a hunted, starving fugitive hiding in the Texas brush into a highly paid, legally sanctioned executioner. Assuming command, Brown swiftly sought to fortify his dominant position by recruiting a capable, trustworthy assistant. He sent a telegraph message south, reaching out directly to a hardened Texas gunman named Ben Wheeler. Wheeler shared a comparable history of operating on both sides of the law, demonstrating a profound proficiency with firearms and an uncompromising nature. The Texan accepted the lucrative offer, traveling north by rail and arriving in Caldwell to officially assume the demanding role of deputy marshal. The newly formed partnership between Chief Marshal Brown and Deputy Wheeler created one of the most effective law enforcement teams on the western frontier. The two men operated in seamless synchronization. They patrolled the freezing streets side by side, their thick canvas coats brushing against the wooden building facades. Wheeler carried a customized double-barrel shotgun, the weapon loaded heavily with coarse buckshot capable of devastating a target at incredibly close range. Brown continued to rely solely on his Winchester rifle and his Colt revolver, his hands calloused from constant meticulous weapon maintenance. The two lawmen rigorously enforced the strict firearm restriction, flatly refusing to grant any exemptions to anyone entering the city limits. They established heavy checkpoints at the primary southern access roads. The substantial financial rewards of his new position allowed Brown to elevate his overall standard of living. He rented a comfortable, well-furnished room in the finest hotel in town, complete with a warm cast-iron stove and thick woolen blankets. He purchased high-quality, expertly tailored clothing, replacing his ragged canvas coats with dark broadcloth suits and polished leather boots. He ate prime cuts of beef in the local restaurants, his meals often provided free of charge by grateful business owners. The citizens of Caldwell treated him constantly with a complex mixture of respect and fear. Despite the comfortable accommodations, Brown remained isolated from the ordinary social life of the community. The quiet winter months provided the new chief marshal with ample time to further refine his municipal administrative skills. He efficiently managed the collection of fines and the mandatory licensing fees required for the saloons to operate legally. By the final days of December 1882, Henry Newton Brown had successfully transformed Caldwell from a deadly border post into a secure, profitable commercial hub. He stood firmly at the pinnacle of his law enforcement career, wielding uncontested power. On January 1, 1883, a biting frost coated the wooden boardwalks of Caldwell, Kansas. The extreme winter temperatures dropped well below freezing, solidifying the deep mud ruts along Main Street into rigid, treacherous trenches. Thin plumes of gray coal smoke rose steadily from the brick chimneys of the commercial district, standing starkly against the pale, cloudless morning sky. Residents wrapped themselves tightly in thick wool coats and knitted scarves, hurrying between the heated interiors of the mercantile shops and their private homes. The frantic, chaotic energy of the summer cattle drives had vanished, leaving behind a quiet, organized civic environment. The municipal leaders arranged a special gathering inside the local opera house to celebrate this newly established tranquility. Prominent bankers, prosperous merchants, and influential livestock brokers filled the wooden folding chairs, their faces reflecting a sense of financial security. The town council had pooled their private resources to purchase a specific, expensive token of their collective gratitude. They intended to publicly honor the man solely responsible for transforming their deadly border post into a secure, profitable enterprise. The unyielding enforcement policies enacted over the previous 6 months had saved countless storefronts from destruction and protected the lives of the civilian population. Henry Newton Brown entered the spacious gas-lit hall wearing a tailored dark broadcloth suit and polished leather boots. He removed his wide-brimmed felt hat, holding it respectfully at his side as he walked down the center aisle. The gathered citizens parted willingly, offering polite nods and quiet murmurs of deep respect for their chief marshal. He stepped up onto the raised wooden stage, standing beside Mayor Mike Colson and several other prominent municipal figures. The warm air inside the building smelled strongly of burning coal, expensive cigar tobacco, and damp wool garments. Mayor Colson stepped forward to address the crowded room, his voice projecting over the assembled audience. He spoke extensively regarding the unprecedented level of safety currently enjoyed by the local businesses and the resident families. He praised the total eradication of celebratory gunfire, the drastic reduction in public brawls, and the efficient management of the transient cowboy population. The mayor emphasized that Caldwell now stood as a shining example of civic order across the western frontier. He attributed this cultural shift to the relentless, uncompromising dedication of their chief law enforcement officer. Turning toward the quiet marshal, Colson motioned to a long, rectangular wooden case resting upon a velvet-draped table. He unlatched the polished brass hinges and lifted the sturdy oak lid, revealing the stunning contents resting snugly within the molded, dark red fabric. A collective gasp of genuine awe rippled through the seated crowd as the bright gas lamps illuminated the pristine weapon inside. It was a factory-new Winchester lever-action rifle, a model 1873 customized to an unparalleled degree of mechanical and visual perfection. The gun represented the absolute pinnacle of modern firearms manufacturing, commissioned for this singular occasion. The receiver of the rifle featured a brilliant, flawless silver plating that gleamed intensely in the artificial light. Master engravers back at the Eastern factory had spent countless hours carving intricate, deeply recessed floral scrollwork across the side panels. The dense walnut stock boasted a rich, dark finish, polished to a mirror-like shine, highlighting the tight, uniform grain of the premium wood. The sturdy octagonal barrel retained a deep bluing, contrasting sharply against the bright silver components. A solid brass elevator block rested inside the open breech, ready to feed cartridges into the pristine steel chamber. Embedded securely into the right side of the wooden buttstock sat a large, perfectly round plate of solid gold. The precious metal caught the ambient light, drawing every eye in the room to the finely etched lettering across its surface. The inscription read plainly and deliberately, declaring the weapon was presented to City Marshal H.N. Brown for valuable services rendered the citizens of Caldwell. The words permanently documented his transition from a wandering, violent drifter into an esteemed pillar of a thriving Kansas community. It was an extravagant, tangible reward for executing a brutal job with terrifying efficiency. Brown reached down, his calloused fingers wrapping firmly around the smooth wooden forearm of the presentation rifle. He lifted the weighty weapon from its velvet resting place, bringing it up to fully evaluate its balance and overall construction. He worked the lever downward, feeling the smooth, perfectly machined glide of the internal steel components. The hammer locked back with a crisp, sharp click, demonstrating the flawless timing of the internal springs and the firing mechanism. He closed the action, nodding silently in deep appreciation of the masterful craftsmanship. The marshal did not offer a lengthy speech of gratitude or a booming declaration of his future intentions. He simply turned toward the audience, holding the customized Winchester across his chest, and offered a brief, respectful bow of his head. The entire hall erupted into sustained, thunderous applause, the prominent merchants standing to express their genuine appreciation. They felt secure knowing this lethal tool rested in the capable hands of a man possessing zero hesitation regarding pulling the trigger. The ceremony concluded with a line of wealthy businessmen stepping forward to shake his hand and offer their personal congratulations. Returning to his private quarters at the Southwestern Hotel, Brown carefully examined every intricate detail of the new firearm. He owned several functional weapons. But this piece represented something different from his battered working guns. It served as a potent symbol of his hard-won respectability and his acceptance by the upper echelons of local society. He loaded the tubular magazine with copper-jacketed cartridges, intending to utilize the gun during his daily operations rather than hanging it uselessly on a wall. He wanted the visiting trail hands to clearly see the golden plate and understand the backing he enjoyed from the municipal government. As the bitter winter slowly yielded to the warmer temperatures of early spring, the thick mud in the streets began to dry. The new season brought the first influx of longhorn cattle up the long trail from the southern ranges. The drovers arrived in Caldwell expecting the usual chaotic environment, only to discover a rigidly controlled, heavily policed settlement. They saw the chief marshal walking the boardwalks, the sunlight flashing brightly off the silver receiver and the gold medallion of his customized rifle. The visual deterrent proved potent, conveying the absolute authority and the uncompromising reputation of the man carrying it. The aggressive tactics established during the previous year yielded a lasting compliance from the transient population. The cowboys surrendered their heavy revolvers at the checkpoints without uttering a single complaint or attempting to resist. The crowded saloons operated at full capacity, yet the patrons maintained a relatively subdued, orderly demeanor while drinking and gambling. Deputy Ben Wheeler continued to patrol alongside Brown, the two men presenting a unified, impenetrable front of municipal power. The anticipated wave of spring violence failed to materialize, leaving the local jail cells empty for days on end. This newfound tranquility drastically altered the daily routine of the chief marshal, replacing intense physical confrontations with mundane administrative tasks. Brown spent hours writing out minor citations for public intoxication, stray livestock wandering the streets, and merchants violating strict closing hours. He collected licensing fees from the various entertainment establishments, carefully logging the incoming revenue into the thick municipal ledgers. He inspected the physical condition of the wooden boardwalks and reported broken planks to the town council for rapid repair. The role shifted from a combat position into a strictly bureaucratic management job. The lack of adrenaline and the absence of constant life-threatening danger introduced a new, unfamiliar sensation into his life. Profound boredom began to settle over him during the long, quiet afternoons spent sitting inside the marshal's office. He cleaned his pristine weapons repeatedly, ensuring the mechanical actions remained free of the fine prairie dust blowing through the open windows. He watched the freight wagons rolling slowly past the door, listening to the monotonous creaking of the wooden wheels. The peaceful environment required none of the specialized lethal skills he had spent his adult life cultivating. Seeking an outlet for his stagnant energy, Brown began participating more actively in the polite social circles of the community. He started courting a young woman named Alice Maud Levegood, the respectable daughter of a successful local brick manufacturer. Alice possessed a quiet, refined demeanor, attending church services regularly and avoiding the rowdy commercial district located near the rail yards. She knew nothing of the bloody actions defining her suitor's previous years in the southwestern territories. To her, Henry Newton Brown was simply a respected, well-paid municipal official keeping her town safe. The courtship proceeded according to the formal rules governing proper society during the era. Brown visited the Levegood household on Sunday afternoon, sitting uncomfortably on the plush parlor furniture while wearing his finest dark suit. He drank tea from delicate porcelain cups, his large, calloused hands contrasting sharply with the fragile dining ware. He engaged in polite conversation with her parents, discussing the local weather, the expanding railroad schedules, and the ongoing construction of new brick buildings. He consciously suppressed every rough edge of his personality, presenting a flawless facade of a tamed, civilized gentleman. Walking Alice down the quiet residential streets during the early evenings provided a stark contrast to his violent history. They strolled beneath the budding elm trees, discussing their shared future and the prospect of building a permanent life in the settlement. Brown enjoyed the peaceful nature of these interactions, yet a deeply ingrained part of his mind constantly scanned the surrounding shadows for hidden threats. The transition from a hunted fugitive sleeping in muddy ditches to a respectable suitor strolling through manicured neighborhoods felt surreal. He actively suppressed the lingering paranoia, forcing himself to fully embrace the domestic tranquility. The Levigood family strongly approved of the match, viewing the chief marshal as a stable, lucrative prospect for their daughter. His monthly salary provided a substantial, reliable income, and his prominent status guaranteed their family a permanent position within the upper tiers of local society. They encouraged the relationship, proudly displaying their connection to the most powerful man in the entire county. The approval of her parents accelerated the courtship, leading to formal discussions regarding a permanent union. Brown committed himself to this new trajectory, determined to solidify his civilian standing. In preparation for their upcoming marriage, Brown utilized his accumulated savings to purchase a piece of valuable real estate. He acquired a spacious lot located on a quiet, respectable street removed from the noise and stench of the stockyards. He hired local carpenters to construct a neat, single-story wooden frame house, dictating the specific layout of the rooms and the placement of the windows. He oversaw the construction process daily, watching the wooden skeletal structure rise from the Kansas dirt. The building represented a massive financial investment and a physical anchor tying him permanently to the town. Furnishing the new residence required trips to the finest mercantile stores located within the settlement. He ordered thick, brightly patterned carpets to cover the wooden floorboards and purchased a cast-iron cooking stove for the kitchen. He selected sturdy oak tables, comfortable upholstered chairs, and a large wooden bed frame for the primary sleeping quarters. He spent his money freely, determined to provide his future bride with a comfortable, thoroughly modern home. The process of building a domestic nest consumed his thoughts, providing a welcome distraction from the tedious nature of his official duties. While his personal life flourished, the underlying financial reality of the pacified town began to subtly impact his income. A significant portion of the marshal's total compensation relied directly on a percentage of the fines collected from arrested troublemakers. Because the trail hands now strictly obeyed the ordinances and actively avoided causing property damage, the municipal revenue generated from citations plummeted drastically. His fixed monthly salary remained substantial, but the lucrative bonus money dried up. Maintaining his elevated lifestyle and funding the construction of the new house placed a growing strain on his financial reserves. Throughout the sweltering summer months of 1883, Brown maintained his rigid patrol schedule alongside Deputy Wheeler. The two men walked the length of Main Street under the blazing sun, their weapons growing uncomfortably hot to the touch. The sheer volume of incoming cattle reached unprecedented highs, bringing thousands of temporary laborers into the confined city limits. Despite the population surge, the crime rate remained astonishingly low, a direct testament to the terrifying effectiveness of their established reputation. The cowboys spent their money on whiskey and gambling, then quietly returned to their camps without drawing a single blade. The lack of action prompted subtle shifts in Brown's behavior. He spent longer hours observing the high-stakes poker games occurring inside the finer gambling halls, closely watching the piles of silver coins shifting across the green felt. He noted the vast sums of currency flowing securely into the vaults of the local banks, transported by unarmed clerks trusting the safety of the streets. He possessed the physical capacity to dominate this environment, yet he remained bound by his oath to protect the very wealth he could easily seize. The disparity between his fixed income and the millions of dollars moving through the railhead grew increasingly apparent. October brought the formal conclusion of the primary driving season, emptying the stockyards and sending the remaining drovers back toward the southern ranges. The town settled into a quiet, prosperous rhythm, the merchants tallying their summer profits while preparing for the approaching winter. Brown finalized the details of his upcoming wedding, securing the services of a local minister and ordering a fresh, custom-tailored suit for the ceremony. He moved his personal belongings from the hotel room into the newly finished wooden house, carefully hanging his clothing in the spacious closets. He placed his gold-plated Winchester rifle in a secure, prominent location within the front parlor. The marriage ceremony took place during the crisp, early weeks of the autumn season. A large crowd of prominent citizens attended the event, filling the wooden pews of the church to witness the union. Mayor Colson and the town council members sat in the front rows, smiling widely as the chief marshal exchanged his formal vows with Alice Maud Levagood. Brown spoke clearly and confidently, pledging his devotion to his new wife and his commitment to their shared future. He slid a polished gold band onto her finger, sealing his integration into the polite, law-abiding society. Following the ceremony, the newlyweds hosted a lavish reception inside the largest dining hall in the settlement. Guests consumed roasted meats, drank imported wines, and offered continuous toasts to the happiness of the couple. Brown navigated the crowded room with practiced ease, shaking hands with the bankers and offering polite conversation to their wives. He smiled and nodded, playing the role of the civilized gentleman to perfection. None of the guests looking upon his tailored suit and well-groomed appearance could envision the brutal, blood-soaked realities of his previous years on the open plains. Settling into domestic life provided a comfortable, predictable routine. Brown woke early each morning eating a warm breakfast, prepared by his wife before walking toward the municipal offices. He spent his days reviewing reports, organizing the duty schedules for his deputies, and occasionally mediating minor civil disputes between rival merchants. He returned home promptly at 6 o'clock every evening, sitting on his front porch and watching the sun set over the distant prairie. The house remained impeccably clean, filled with the soft ticking of a parlor clock and the smell of fresh baking. Yet, beneath the calm exterior of this perfect civilian existence, a deeply suppressed restlessness stubbornly persisted. He was a man built and trained for extreme lethal environments, now confined within a safe, highly regulated cage of his own making. The quiet evenings felt unnaturally long, lacking the sharp, vital edge of constant danger he had known since childhood. He stared at the golden plate affixed to his pristine rifle, tracing the engraved letters with his thumb. The town had purchased his loyalty, trading an engraved piece of hardware and a steady wage for his unmatched capacity for violence. As December 1883 covered the Kansas plains in a fresh layer of bright white snow, Caldwell stood tamed. The thoroughfares remained free of gunfire, the saloons operated without disruption, and the merchant vaults overflowed with accumulated silver. Henry Newton Brown had succeeded in his mandated mission, neutralizing every single threat to the municipal prosperity. He possessed a loving wife, a beautiful new home, and the highest level of respect available within the community. He had conquered the town, leaving nothing left for him to fight, subdue, or overcome. Sitting beside his cast-iron stove during the final freezing nights of the year, he listened to the howling wind rattling the glass window panes. The absolute security of his position paradoxically generated a profound, gnawing dissatisfaction deep within his mind. The vast sums of unsecured currency sitting in neighboring, less protected towns began to occupy his thoughts with increasing frequency. The gold rifle resting in the corner served as a constant reminder of his lethal capabilities, a tool designed specifically for action rather than passive display. The Border Queen was thoroughly broken and pacified, but the man holding the leash remained fundamentally untamed. On April 1, 1884, an ingrained restlessness overpowered the civilized facade of the Caldwell chief marshal, pulling his thoughts toward coordinated theft. Henry Newton Brown sat inside his furnished wooden house, staring blankly at the polished gold plate secured to his presentation rifle, finding zero satisfaction in his guaranteed civic safety. The vast sums of unprotected currency resting inside the vaults of neighboring, less defended settlements dominated his daily calculations. He formulated a calculated scheme to exploit his own impeccable law enforcement reputation, deciding to utilize his silver badge as a flawless shield for a lucrative robbery. The target selected for this illicit enterprise sat 70 miles west, nestled within the rolling topography of Barber County. The town of Medicine Lodge possessed a prosperous financial institution known across the territory as the Medicine Valley Bank. This specific establishment securely held the accumulated wealth of the surrounding cattle ranches and agricultural farms, storing tens of thousands of dollars in paper bills and silver coins. Brown thoroughly understood the physical layout of these rural depositories, knowing they relied on brick walls and iron locks rather than armed security details. He viewed the distant building as a vulnerable, stationary mark. Executing a robbery of this magnitude required capable accomplices possessing a willingness to commit lethal violence on command. Brown bypassed the local criminal element operating within Caldwell, turning instead to the single man he trusted within his own jurisdiction. Deputy Ben Wheeler shared the same dangerous energy, his commitment to the municipal statutes proving just as shallow as his superior's oath. The two peace officers sat inside the dimly lit marshal's office during the quietest late-night hours, whispering their treasonous plans while the town they swore to protect slept soundly around them. Two men could not safely control a bank interior while simultaneously managing nervous getaway horses and watching the exterior thoroughfare for approaching threats. Wheeler suggested recruiting 2 hardened Texas cowboys currently drifting through the territory, individuals possessing the required equestrian skills and a lack of moral hesitation. William Smith and John Wesley eagerly accepted the secret invitation to join the illicit strike, drawn forcefully by the promise of a life-altering payday. The 4 conspirators formed a mobile strike team, blending the strategic planning of seasoned lawmen with the raw aggression of desperate frontier drifters. To mask their departure from Caldwell, Brown fabricated a plausible, officially sanctioned cover story for the town council. He publicly announced his firm intention to track down a wanted fugitive reported to be hiding deep within the rugged canyons of the Indian Territory. This elaborate deception provided a flawless excuse for the chief marshal and his deputy to ride out of town armed and fully supplied for a prolonged, dangerous journey. The mayor wished them well, oblivious to the dark reality that their paid enforcers were actively transitioning back into the ruthless predators they were hired to eliminate. During the final week of April, the 4 men gathered their necessary supplies, focusing on maximum speed and overwhelming firepower. They selected their strongest, fastest horses, animals capable of sustaining a grueling gallop across treacherous, uneven ground for hours. Brown packed his customized presentation rifle, fully intending to utilize the engraved weapon to secure the illicit fortune. Wheeler loaded his double-barrel shotgun with fresh shells packed tightly with coarse, destructive buckshot. They filled their leather saddlebags with extra ammunition, cold provisions, and canvas dusters designed to conceal their identities and protect their weapons from the harsh spring elements. The ride westward commenced. Under deceivingly clear skies, the mounts moving at a steady, ground-eating trot across the sprawling Kansas prairie. Brown rode at the head of the tight column, the polished silver receiver of his Winchester glinting brightly in the morning sunlight. He felt a familiar, long-dormant surge of cold adrenaline pumping through his veins, the thrilling anticipation of an impending strike erasing months of dull, bureaucratic boredom. The badge pinned to his vest felt like an absurd joke, a meaningless piece of tin masking the true, violent nature of the man wearing it. He focused on the distant horizon. As they crossed the open distances of Barber County, the atmospheric conditions began to shift drastically. Dark storm clouds gathered ominously in the western sky, churning with violent energy and blocking out the warmth of the afternoon sun. The ambient temperature plummeted rapidly, bringing a biting wind that whipped forcefully across the flat, exposed terrain. The men unrolled their canvas coats, wrapping themselves tightly against the impending deluge. The severe change in weather provided an advantageous tactical benefit, promising to clear the streets of their target town and obscure any potential pursuit. The storm broke with savage intensity on the evening of April 29th, unleashing a torrential downpour that saturated the dry earth. The relentless rain turned the dusty wagon trails into deep rivers of clinging mud. The horses struggled fiercely against the slick footing, their hooves sinking deep into the mire with every labored step forward. Lightning flashed violently across the blackened sky, illuminating the rugged terrain in stark, jagged bursts of blinding white light. The deafening crack of rolling thunder masked the sound of their approach, swallowing the rhythmic drumming of the galloping hooves. On April 30th, 1884, the four riders reached the muddy outskirts of Medicine Lodge shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning. The freezing spring downpour continued to hammer the isolated settlement, turning the unpaved thoroughfares into a desolate swamp. The severe weather forced the local citizens indoors, leaving the wooden boardwalks empty and reducing the number of potential witnesses on the street. Brown signaled for a halt near a dense grove of native trees, pulling his wide-brimmed hat low over his eyes to shield his face from the driving rain. They conducted a final silent check of their firearms. The conspirators split into two distinct pairs to avoid drawing unnecessary attention as they infiltrated the commercial district. Smith and Wesley rode slowly down the main avenue, their faces obscured by high collars and dripping hat brims, acting as advance scouts checking for any organized resistance. Brown and Wheeler utilized the narrow alleyways running behind the primary row of storefronts, keeping their horses out of direct sight from the street-facing windows. The cold rain soaked through their canvas coats, chilling their skin and stiffening their joints. But the burning anticipation of the robbery overrode the physical discomfort. The Medicine Valley Bank occupied a sturdy single-story brick building near the center of the settlement. A narrow alleyway separated the financial institution from a large wooden livery stable, providing a perfectly concealed approach to the rear entrance. Brown and his accomplices converged in this muddy corridor, dismounting swiftly and tying their nervous horses to a sturdy coal shed located behind the bank. They secured the leather reins tightly, ensuring the animals would not bolt when the inevitable gunfire erupted. The rain pounded heavily against the tin roof of the shed, creating a constant deafening roar. Brown drew his customized Winchester from its leather scabbard, wiping the rainwater from the silver receiver with his soaked sleeve. Wheeler unlatched the retaining strap on his shotgun, his thumb resting firmly on the dual hammers. They communicated through sharp nods and precise hand signals, the complex plan having been rehearsed countless times during the long, freezing ride. Smith and Wesley took up positions near the rear door, tasked with securing the exit and watching for any interference from the adjacent livery stable. Brown and Wheeler moved toward the front entrance, their boots sinking silently into the deep mud. Inside the warm, dry interior of the bank, the daily business operations proceeded without any suspicion of the impending doom approaching the door. George Geppert, the highly respected chief cashier, stood behind the polished wooden counter, meticulously organizing stacks of paper currency and recording deposits in a leather ledger. Elisha W. Payne, the bank president and a prominent local rancher, sat at his large mahogany desk in the rear office, reviewing loan applications. The crackling fire inside the cast-iron stove provided a comfortable contrast to the raging storm outside, lulling the two men into a false sense of security. The wooden front door swung open violently, bringing a sudden gust of freezing wind and rain into the quiet lobby. Brown and Wheeler stepped across the threshold, their soaked dusters dripping muddy water onto the clean floorboards. Brown leveled his gold-plated rifle directly at the cashier's chest, his face an impassive mask of cold, uncompromising lethality. Wheeler flanked him, raising his double-barrel shotgun and scanning the rear office for any hidden threats. The terrifying appearance of the armed men shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the bank in a fraction of a second. Brown demanded compliance with a low, forceful command, instructing Geppert to raise his hands and step away from the cash drawers. The marshal fully expected the terrified clerk to obey without hesitation, relying on the sheer intimidation of the pointed firearms to secure the money. He required Geppert to open the iron vault, a task requiring specific combinations and physical effort. The success of the operation hinged on the rapid, unopposed cooperation of the unarmed bank employees. Brown kept his finger resting lightly on the trigger, prepared to use force but preferring a clean, silent extraction. George Geppert possessed an unyielding loyalty to the institution and a stubborn refusal to surrender the entrusted funds to outlaws. Instead of raising his hands in submissive terror, the cashier reacted with defiant bravery. He lunged toward the open vault door, attempting to swing the iron barrier shut and spin the combination dial to permanently lock away the currency. He shouted a loud, frantic warning to the bank president in the back room, his voice piercing the tense silence of the lobby. This unexpected heroic resistance derailed the carefully constructed timeline of the robbery. Recognizing the collapse of his strategy and the imminent loss of the targeted fortune, Brown reacted with devastating efficiency. He did not issue a second warning or attempt to physically subdue the struggling cashier. He tracked Geppert's movement with the barrel of his Winchester and firmly squeezed the trigger. The rifle discharged with a concussive boom, filling the enclosed space with a blinding flash of fire and a cloud of sulphurous smoke. The solid copper projectile struck Geppert squarely in the chest at point-blank range, tearing violently through his ribcage. The physical trauma of the slug lifted the cashier off his feet, throwing him forcefully against the cold iron surface of the vault. Blood erupted from the exit wound, splashing brightly against the gray metal and soaking the scattered financial ledgers on the counter. Geppert collapsed onto the wooden floorboards, his life draining rapidly into the spreading crimson pool. He managed to successfully seal the vault mechanism just seconds before losing consciousness, sacrificing his own life to secure the town's wealth. The heroic action guaranteed the robbers would leave the building empty-handed. The thunderous roar of the rifle shot alerted Elisha Payne in the rear office to the deadly reality unfolding in the lobby. The bank president recognized the extreme danger and scrambled desperately to defend himself against the attackers. He lunged toward a desk drawer, grasping the wooden handle of a hidden revolver stored inside. Wheeler spotted the rapid movement through the open doorway and reacted with terrifying, brutal speed. The deputy marshal leveled his shotgun, aiming the wide, dual barrels directly at the rising figure of the prominent rancher. Wheeler pulled the front trigger, unleashing a devastating payload of coarse buckshot across the short distance. The clustered pellets struck Payne with horrific force, tearing ragged holes through his right shoulder and upper torso. The sheer physical power of the blast shattered his collarbone and destroyed his ability to hold the retrieved weapon. Payne cried out in sheer agony, stumbling backward and collapsing onto his polished mahogany desk. The papers scattered across the floor, quickly absorbing the bright red blood pouring from his terrible, ragged wounds. The interior of the Medicine Valley Bank now resembled a chaotic, blood-soaked slaughterhouse. Acrid smoke hung in the air, stinging the eyes and burning the throats of the attackers. Brown stepped rapidly over the bleeding body of the cashier, grasping the iron handle of the vault and pulling with all his strength. The door remained immobile, the internal locking mechanisms firmly engaged by Geppert's final desperate act. The realization hit the marshal with crushing certainty. The vast fortune was inaccessible, permanently sealed behind inches of solid steel. The deafening volume of the gunfire inside the brick building effectively canceled out the noise of the raging rainstorm outside. Reverend George Friedley, standing near the entrance of the adjacent livery stable, heard the unmistakable, booming reports of the rifle and shotgun. He peered through the driving rain, spotting the nervous, saddle-blanketed horses tied to the coal shed in the alleyway. Recognizing a robbery in progress, the Reverend did not retreat into the shadows. He raised his voice in a frantic, booming shout, alerting the armed citizens of Medicine Lodge to the violent assault occurring in the center of their town. The alarm spread through the commercial district with astonishing speed, drawing heavily armed merchants and off-duty cowboys out into the freezing deluge. Men grabbed their rifles and revolvers, rushing toward the bank with a fierce collective determination to defend their settlement. The robbers inside heard the shouts and the rapidly approaching footsteps sloshing through the mud. Brown understood the tactical situation had deteriorated into an absolute nightmare. The element of surprise was gone, the vault remained locked, and a civilian militia was currently surrounding the building. Abandoning the failed objective, Brown shouted the command to retreat. He and Wheeler turned away from the bleeding bankers, sprinting frantically toward the rear exit of the building. They burst through the wooden door, plunging back into the freezing rain and the clinging mud of the alleyway. Smith and Wesley waited by the coal shed, their weapons drawn, frantically trying to calm the panicked horses. The animals plunged and reared, terrified by the loud gunfire and the chaotic shouting echoing down the narrow corridor. The four men scrambled to untie the wet leather reins, their cold fingers slipping on the stiff, soaked material. Bullets began snapping through the air around them, fired by the converging citizens taking up firing positions at the ends of the alley. The projectiles slammed into the brick walls and splintered the wooden planks of the coal shed, sending sharp fragments flying into the rain. Brown vaulted into his saddle, his Winchester held tightly in his right hand, spurring his frightened mount aggressively toward the southern exit of the tight enclosure. Wheeler swung his leg over his horse, raising his shotgun and firing a blind blast down the alleyway to force the pursuing citizens to take cover. The booming discharge provided a brief, vital second of suppression, allowing the four riders to burst out of the confined space and onto the wider side street. They spurred their animals into a desperate, plunging gallop, their hooves kicking up massive geysers of brown mud. The rain lashed fiercely against their faces, blinding their vision and soaking their clothing as they fled the scene of their catastrophic failure. A hail of civilian gunfire followed them as they raced out of the town limits. Copper slugs whined past their ears, splashing harmlessly into the flooded puddles or striking the wooden fence posts lining the road. Brown rode low over the neck of his horse, urging the animal forward with brutal, unrelenting kicks. He glanced backward, watching the angry mob fading into the gray mist of the heavy storm. They had botched the robbery, committing 2 brutal murders without securing a single silver coin. The flawless reputation of the Caldwell chief marshal was permanently, irrevocably destroyed. The fugitives pushed their exhausted mounts toward the rugged, treacherous topography of the Gyp Hills, seeking the safety of the deep, twisting canyons located south of the settlement. The relentless downpour continued to soak the earth, turning the prairie into a vast, impassable bog. The horses labored heavily, their chests heaving with exertion as they fought against the deep mud and the freezing temperatures. Brown rode in grim silence, the weight of his colossal miscalculation settling firmly onto his shoulders. He had traded his comfortable house, his respected position, and his new wife for the desperate, hunted existence of a fleeing murderer. The storm offered a temporary shield from the organized pursuit, but the tracks left by the galloping horses provided a clear, undeniable trail through the saturated ground. The citizens of Medicine Lodge, enraged by the brutal slaughter of their prominent residents, quickly organized a heavily armed posse. The hunters saddled their fresh mounts, undeterred by the foul weather, determined to track down the killers and enact swift, uncompromising vengeance. As Henry Newton Brown vanished into the blinding rain, he rode directly toward the inescapable, violent conclusion of his dark and treacherous path. On April 30th, 1884, Henry Newton Brown pushed his exhausted horse southward through the relentless Kansas rainstorm, desperately seeking the rugged sanctuary of the Gyp Hills. The chilling downpour saturated the flat prairie, transforming the hard dirt into a treacherous expanse of clinging clay that severely drained the stamina from the fleeing animals. William Smith and John Wesley rode close behind the former lawman, their faces pale and drawn following the catastrophic failure at the bank. Ben Wheeler brought up the rear of the tight column, constantly turning in his saddle to monitor their fading back trail. An icy northern wind howled across the barren landscape, biting through their wet canvas dusters and chilling the outlaws straight to the bone. Their deep, muddy tracks provided an unmistakable path for the enraged citizens of Medicine Lodge to follow. A well-armed posse rode aggressively on their heels, ignoring the foul weather in their pursuit of justice. These local hunters utilized fresh mounts, allowing them to rapidly close the distance across the saturated ground without tiring. The townsmen carried lever-action rifles and coiled ropes, driven by a unified desire to enact swift vengeance for their murdered neighbors. The gap separating the pursuers from the fugitives shrank noticeably as the afternoon hours dragged onward. The fleeing men pushed their animals well beyond safe limits, whipping the lathered flanks with the ends of their leather reins. The topography shifted dramatically as the group crossed into the treacherous expanse of the canyon lands. Jagged red sandstone formations rose sharply from the prairie floor, creating a confusing labyrinth of narrow, winding corridors. The robbers navigated the slick slopes with extreme caution, seeking a defensible position or a hidden route across the territorial border. Sheer rock walls funneled the freezing wind, intensifying the bitter cold while obscuring their line of sight. Their horses stumbled frequently on loose stones, iron shoes sliding dangerously on the wet, uneven surfaces. The distinct sound of cracking brush echoing from the northern ridges confirmed the posse remained attached to their trail. Fatigue rapidly deteriorated the physical condition of the fleeing party and their mounts. Brown felt the trembling muscles of his gelding beneath his saddle, recognizing the undeniable signs of impending collapse. The animal's chest heaved with violent exertion, pulling gasps of cold air into burning lungs. White foam gathered around the steel bit, mixing freely with the rainwater dripping from the leather bridle. The former marshal knew their current galloping pace was unsustainable for much longer. He scanned the towering rock faces, searching the perimeter for a tactical advantage, finding only steep cliffs boxing them into the valley. The terrain itself had turned hostile, actively hindering their desperate flight. Turning a sharp corner, within the labyrinth, the four men spurred their horses into a steep-walled ravine. They rode forcefully over loose gravel, hoping to discover a concealed exit leading toward the safety of the Indian Territory. The corridor narrowed drastically as they progressed, the towering red walls closing in and blocking out the gray afternoon light. The riders rounded a final bend, pulling their mounts to a sudden sliding halt in the mud. A sheer face of solid stone loomed directly in front of them, sealing off the far end of the canyon. They had ridden blindly into a fatal, inescapable dead end. Panic surged through the trapped gunmen as they realized the catastrophic nature of their navigational error. They spun their exhausted horses around in the narrow space, intending to retrace their path out of the gorge. Before they could spur the animals forward, a booming volley of rifle fire erupted from the high ridges above the entrance. The Medicine Lodge posse had successfully flanked the fugitives deploying skilled marksmen along the elevated rim of the box canyon. Copper projectiles slammed into the rocky floor all around them, sending sharp fragments of sandstone flying through the air. The trap had closed firmly shut, sealing the killers inside the stone walls. Brown shouted a rapid command to dismount, leaping from his saddle and dragging his customized Winchester from its leather scabbard. Wheeler, Smith, and Wesley scrambled off their horses, diving for cover behind a cluster of fallen boulders littering the canyon floor. The terrified animals, exposed to the plunging crossfire, bolted wildly toward the sealed end of the ravine to escape the noise. The posse maintained a steady, punishing barrage from the high ground, the slugs whining viciously as they ricocheted off the hard walls. The outlaws flattened their bodies against the wet rocks, pinned down securely by the superior positioning of their pursuers. The tactical disadvantage proved overwhelming for the cornered men. The gunmen on the rim possessed a clear, unobstructed view of the canyon floor, while the trapped fugitives could only see gun barrels poking over the rocky edge. Brown pressed his shoulder firmly against a coarse boulder, angling his gold-plated rifle upward toward the sky. He squeezed the trigger, sending a desperate shot toward a puff of white smoke on the ridge above. Return fire intensified in response, forcing him to duck his head as a bullet chipped the rock mere inches from his face. Sharp shards of flying stone stung his cheek, drawing a thin line of red blood. Rain continued to fall steadily, turning the bottom of the ravine into a miserable, muddy pool of standing water. Wet canvas dusters clung heavily to the outlaws' limbs, restricting their movements and draining their remaining body heat. Wheeler crouched low, his double-barrel shotgun useless against targets positioned hundreds of feet out of range. He cursed loudly, frustrated by the futility of their defensive situation. Smith and Wesley huddled closely together behind a separate rock, their faces pale and their eyes wide with sheer terror. The two drifting cowboys realized their promise of easy wealth had transformed into a guaranteed death sentence. Ammunition quickly became a critical issue for the trapped men. They had packed extra cartridges inside their saddlebags, but those vital supplies now rested on the backs of panicked horses huddled at the far end of the canyon. To retrieve the leather pouches meant sprinting across 40 yards of open ground under concentrated rifle fire. Brown checked his pockets, counting the remaining rounds for his lever-action weapon. The meager supply would only last a few more minutes against the relentless barrage pouring down from the rim. The cold reality of their impending slaughter settled over the desperate group. The posse systematically tightened the noose, shifting their positions along the high ridges to eliminate any remaining blind spots. The gunmen below could hear the angry shouts of the citizens echoing off the canyon walls, calling for the unconditional surrender or total annihilation of the murderers. The townspeople possessed ample ammunition and the support of the surrounding community. They could easily maintain the siege for days, starving the outlaws or waiting for them to freeze in the bitter spring storm. Time heavily favored the hunters, while the fugitives possessed zero viable options for escape. Brown assessed the grim circumstances with a cold, detached logic. Fighting to the death in the muddy ravine guaranteed destruction within the hour. Surrendering offered a microscopic chance of survival, relying on the fragile legal process to delay their executions. He looked at his companions, reading the same desperate conclusion in their exhausted, frightened eyes. Wheeler nodded slowly, lowering his useless shotgun to the mud. Smith and Wesley offered no protests, broken by the overwhelming force arrayed against them. The decision was made. The legendary Caldwell chief marshal would lay down his weapons. Brown raised his voice, shouting forcefully over the deafening roar of the gunfire and the howling wind. He called out to the men on the ridge, offering to cease hostilities and surrender peacefully. A tense silence fell over the canyon as the posse paused their firing, the echoing cracks fading into the steady drumming of the rain. A voice yelled back from the high ground, demanding the outlaws step out from behind the boulders with their hands raised empty in the air. The instructions were clear, leaving no room for trickery or hidden weapons. The moment required a total relinquishment of power. Brown stood up slowly, stepping away from the protective cover of the fallen rocks. He held his pristine gold-plated Winchester in his right hand, the engraved silver receiver dark and wet from the storm. He tossed the beautiful weapon forward, watching it splash into the thick mud. The prized presentation rifle, the ultimate symbol of his civic authority, lay abandoned in the dirt. Wheeler followed suit, throwing his shotgun onto the ground. Smith and Wesley discarded their revolvers, stepping out with their hands reaching toward the gray sky. Armed townsmen scrambled rapidly down the steep, rocky slopes, their rifles trained firmly on the 4 surrendered men. The citizens moved with aggressive, rigid caution, fully aware of the lethal capabilities possessed by their captives. They converged on the muddy canyon floor, surrounding the outlaws in a tight circle of steel barrels. The fury in their eyes was palpable, fueled by the fresh memory of the slaughtered bank officials. They ordered the fugitives to turn around and interlace their fingers behind their heads, stepping forward to thoroughly search their wet clothing for concealed pistols. Physical restraints were applied with unforgiving force. The posse produced thick lengths of coarse hemp rope, binding the wrists of the captives tightly behind their backs. They pulled the rough fibers incredibly taut, cutting deeply into the flesh and stopping the circulation to the men's hands. Brown offered no resistance, standing perfectly still as the angry citizens secured his arms. His face remained a rigid, emotionless mask, betraying none of the profound humiliation churning inside his mind. He had transitioned from the most powerful enforcer in Kansas to a helpless, bound prisoner. The posse retrieved the panicked horses from the far end of the canyon, forcing the bound men back into their wet leather saddles. Captors tied the prisoners' boots securely beneath the bellies of the animals, ensuring they could not attempt a sudden leap for freedom. The miserable ride back to Medicine Lodge commenced under the continuing downpour. The captive gunmen rode in the center of the column, closely guarded by dozens of furious riders. The sheer number of guards eliminated any possibility of an ambush or a rescue attempt by unknown accomplices. The returning column reached the outskirts of the settlement as dusk began to fall, casting deep, gloomy shadows over the muddy thoroughfares. The storm showed no signs of abating, the cold rain washing the blood from the boardwalks where the morning violence had occurred. Word of the successful capture had spread rapidly, drawing a large crowd of residents out into the freezing weather. The townspeople lined the main street, screaming vicious insults and hurling clumps of wet mud at the exhausted prisoners. The atmosphere crackled with dangerous energy, the mob demanding extrajudicial vengeance. Local authorities struggled to maintain control as they guided the captives toward the small wooden municipal lockup. Guards physically shoved the angry citizens aside, forming a protective barrier around the 4 men to prevent a lynching in the street. They hauled Brown, Wheeler, Smith, and Wesley from their saddles, dragging them forcefully through the doors of the jail. The structure offered minimal security, consisting of a single cramped cell with thick iron bars and a small barred window facing the rear alleyway. Guards shoved the prisoners inside, securing the padlock with a loud click. Inside the dark, freezing cell, the 4 men huddled together on the hard wooden floorboards. Dampness seeped deep into their bones, their wet clothing offering zero protection against the plunging nighttime temperatures. Bound wrists throbbed with a dull, constant agony, the rough rope tearing the skin whenever they shifted their weight. Outside the thin wooden walls, the angry roar of the gathering mob grew steadily louder. The residents of Medicine Lodge were not satisfied with a formal trial. They desired a much faster, far more brutal resolution to the day's tragic events. Brown understood the grim reality of their situation. The flimsy wooden jail could not possibly withstand a determined assault by a massive armed crowd. Recognized the distinct sound of numerous voices shouting in unison, the angry clamor mixing with the steady drumming of the rain on the tin roof. A profound, crushing sense of finality settled heavily over the former chief marshal. He knew with absolute certainty that he would not survive to see the sunrise. The calculated risk of the bank robbery had resulted in unmitigated disaster. Seeking a small measure of closure, Brown requested a piece of paper and a pencil from the nervous guard standing outside the iron bars. The guard, feeling a brief flicker of pity for the doomed men, complied with the request, passing the items through the narrow gap. Working with bound hands proved incredibly difficult, forcing Brown to hold the small wooden pencil awkwardly between his numb fingers. He crouched near the dim light of a single kerosene lantern resting in the corridor, resting the paper firmly on his bent knee. He composed a brief, desperately sad letter to his new wife Alice back in Caldwell. He wrote slowly, his cramped handwriting reflecting the physical pain of his bindings and the immense psychological weight of his impending doom. He did not attempt to justify his actions or offer empty excuses for his incredible betrayal. He simply expressed his deep love for her and his profound regret for the terrible shame he had brought upon their family name. He instructed her to sell their beautiful new house and use the funds to build a decent life far away. Brown finished the short letter, folding the coarse paper carefully and handing it back through the iron bars to the waiting guard. The task provided a fleeting distraction, but the reality of the angry mob outside quickly shattered the quiet moment. The shouting grew deafening, accompanied by the heavy thud of axes and sledgehammers striking the exterior wooden walls of the small building. The citizens had bypassed the front door entirely, deciding to breach the rear of the structure to gain direct access to the cramped cell. Wooden planks splintered and cracked under the relentless, punishing blows. The prisoners backed away from the rear wall, their eyes wide with sheer terror as sharp metal axe blades pierced through the timber. Wheeler cursed loudly, kicking at the door in a futile display of defiance. Smith and Wesley cowered in the darkest corner, weeping openly as the terrifying reality of their imminent lynching broke their spirits. Brown stood perfectly still, his muscles coiled tight, his mind racing through impossible scenarios of escape. The rear wall finally gave way with a massive, splintering crash. A gaping hole opened into the alleyway, revealing a sea of angry, rain-soaked faces illuminated by the flickering light of handheld lanterns. Dozens of armed men surged forward, their eyes burning with unrestrained fury. The mob possessed thick hemp nooses, the rough ropes coiled and ready to execute the trapped murderers. The sheer volume of the crowd pressing against the building overwhelmed the lone guard stationed inside, forcing him to flee for his own safety. Leaders of the vigilante group reached through the jagged opening, grabbing the iron bars of the cell and hauling on them with immense collective strength. Rusty hinges groaned in protest, the heavy metal door bending under the extreme pressure. With a final violent heave, the lock shattered and the door swung open, exposing the four bound men to the fury of the mob. Townspeople surged into the small enclosure, grabbing the terrified prisoners by their wet coats and dragging them roughly toward the gaping hole in the rear wall. The mob hauled the captives out into the freezing, muddy alleyway. Chaos was absolute, with men shouting conflicting orders and pushing each other to get closer to the condemned killers. Brown felt the rough hands gripping his arms, the intense pressure of the crowd crushing him from all sides. He realized this was his final, fleeting opportunity. The physical restraints on his wrists had loosened slightly during the violent struggle inside the cell. He twisted his arms with savage, desperate force, ignoring the tearing flesh as he slipped his bloody hands free from the coarse hemp rope. With his arms finally unbound, Brown launched himself forward with explosive, terrified energy. He shoved violently past the men holding him, utilizing his broad shoulders and heavy frame to batter his way through the dense crowd. He burst out of the center of the mob, his boots hitting the deep mud of the alleyway as he began a frantic, desperate sprint toward the open street. The sudden, unexpected escape attempt stunned the vigilantes for a fraction of a second. A loud shout rang out, alerting the armed men to the fleeing prisoner splashing wildly through the dark puddles. A citizen standing near the edge of the alley raised a heavy double-barrel shotgun, tracking the sprinting figure in the dim lantern light. Brown pumped his arms fiercely, his eyes fixed firmly on the dark, empty street ahead. He covered 20 yards before the vigilante pulled the trigger. The thunderous blast ripped through the freezing night, unleashing a wide spread of large, devastating buckshot. The dense metal pellets struck Henry Newton Brown squarely in the back, tearing violently through his spine and vital organs. The physical trauma dropped him instantly, his lifeless body plunging heavily into the freezing, rain-soaked mud, ending the contradictory life of the golden-badged executioner.